When Japan advanced south in December 1941, British planners had long considered Singapore an anchor of imperial defense. The naval base housed fuel reserves measured in hundreds of thousands of tons. Dry docks could service battleships displacing over 30,000 tons. Coastal artillery pieces with barrels stretching over 50 feet were in place to repel seaborne assault. Some guns fired shells weighing nearly 2,000 pounds. The assumption hardened over decades: any attacker would arrive from the sea. Japan did not follow that script. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces landed in northern Malaya and advanced south along the peninsula. Approximately 70,000 Japanese troops, supported by tanks weighing under 15 tons and artillery batteries hauled over rough roads, pushed through terrain British commanders considered restrictive. Bicycle infantry units covered miles per day, outpacing defensive repositioning. Air superiority fractured British supply lines and command communication. British and Commonwealth forces in Malaya and Singapore numbered over 80,000 by early 1942, including British, Australian, and Indian units. Yet equipment distribution was uneven. Aircraft losses mounted rapidly under Japanese air assault. Naval reinforcement faltered after the sinking of battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse, together displacing over 70,000 tons of steel by Japanese torpedo bombers in December 1941. Inside a forward defensive position north of Singapore's Causeway, a British infantryman felt the concussion of artillery shells landing nearby. Sweat ran under a tropical sun that offered no concealment. Rifles jammed under humidity. Ammunition stocks, though substantial in depots, could not always reach frontline units under constant bombardment. Japanese forces crossed the Johor Strait in February 1942 under cover of darkness and artillery fire. Assault boats ferried troops across water barely a mile wide at certain points. British defensive lines fractured as infiltration tactics bypassed strong points. Tanks, though lighter than many Allied models, maneuvered along roads and plantation tracks that defenders had not fully fortified. When I examined British engineering reports written before the invasion alongside after-action summaries compiled during the siege, I noticed repeated references to incomplete defensive preparation on the northern shore. Emphasis had long focused on naval assault. Resources allocated inland did not match the scale of threat that materialized. Once Japanese units established footholds on the island, fighting compressed into urban and industrial zones. Artillery exchanges consumed shells measured in tons per day. Water reservoirs became critical objectives. Civilian populations sought shelter as infrastructure eroded under bombardment. The garrison's situation deteriorated quickly. Casualties accumulated. Some units reported effective strengths reduced by more than 30% within days of intense combat. Water shortages intensified. Japanese artillery repositioned to fire into key installations. The assumption of invulnerability collapsed under concentrated assault. On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore. Approximately 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops entered captivity. It was one of the largest capitulations in British military history. For Japan, the victory delivered a strategic port and inflicted a psychological shock across the British Empire. Steel emplacements and coastal guns had not failed mechanically. They had been bypassed and misapplied. Strategic planning that emphasized naval assault eroded flexibility when land-based advance collided with underprepared defenses. Air superiority and rapid movement outpaced British recalibration. For soldiers on the ground, defeat did not register as a grand turning point. It registered as the order to stack rifles and march into captivity. Humidity clung to uniforms. Roads that had once carried supply trucks now carried columns of prisoners. If you were listening now, perhaps letting the quiet settle around you, imagine that fortified harbor at dusk, silent guns overlooking calm water while fighting rages inland. The weight of expectation pressed on concrete and steel, yet events moved elsewhere. Let that image rest gently in your thoughts. This is the entire history of the siege of Singapore. Britain's worst defeat in the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Bicycle Spoke That Broke an Empire. The 18th of November, 1941. Saigon. Inside a converted warehouse on Rue Cadenet, beneath ceiling fans that barely stirred the humid air, a Japanese quartermaster named Kawamura sat at a wooden desk, amending a requisition order. The original document called for 4,200 bicycles. He crossed it out. In careful script, he wrote 6,000. The notation in the margin read simply, Kawamura's request. No one in that room understood they were looking at the logistical blueprint of an empire's collapse. The bicycles weren't going to couriers or postal workers. They were going to war. When I first encountered this ledger, archived in the Japanese Defense Ministry's collection, catalog reference buried in a filing system that still uses the old Showa-era numbering, I'll admit I thought it was a clerical error. Bicycles. 6,000 of them. It seemed almost comic set against the broader machinery of the Pacific War. But then I cross-referenced it with British intelligence summaries from late 1941, and the picture clarified. The British weren't ignoring bicycle requisitions. They were dismissing them. One intelligence memo, dated the 3rd of December 1941, describes Japanese transport preparations as primarily motorized, with some coolie labor anticipated. Coolie labor. That single phrase contains the racist assumption that would cost Britain everything. They looked at bicycles and saw poverty. The Japanese looked at bicycles and saw mobility. The modification process began in mid-November across workshops in Saigon, Hainan, and southern Taiwan. Standard civilian bicycle frames, many of them manufactured in Birmingham and Sheffield before 1939 and sold across Asia as colonial exports, were stripped of fenders, fitted with reinforced crossbars, and equipped with rifle clips welded to the frame. The gear ratio was adjusted to 3.2 to 1, a specific calibration that allowed a loaded bicycle carrying 40 kilograms of equipment to maintain 25 kilometers per day on damaged roads. These weren't improvisations, they were engineering solutions to a problem British planners never thought to ask. What if the invasion doesn't need petrol? Loading docks at Hainan on the 4th of December, 1941. Photographic evidence from the Japanese Army archives shows bicycles stacked in rows beside Type 95 light tanks. The visual contrast is almost absurd. Modern armor beside what looks like delivery equipment. But the tonnage tells a different story. Between the 10th of November and the 1st of December, exactly 4,762 tons of bicycle-related equipment moved through Taiwanese ports. That's frames, spare parts, tire repair kits, and replacement chains. For context, that exceeded the weight allocated to field artillery for the entire 25th Army. Someone in the Japanese Logistics Command understood that wheels matter more than guns if the guns can't reach the battlefield. British intelligence saw the photographs. They filed them under auxiliary transport. They didn't see an invasion. They saw bicycles. The specificity of the preparations fascinates me because it reveals something about how empires think. The British were planning for a war they recognized: motor convoys, naval bombardment, air superiority, textbook operations. The Japanese were planning for the war the terrain would actually permit. Malayan roads in 1941 weren't autobahns. They were laterite tracks that turned to soup under monsoon rain, with bridges rated for ox carts, not supply trucks. A bicycle didn't care. It could be carried across a blown bridge, pushed through mud, and required no fuel beyond rice and water for the rider. The modification to remove fenders wasn't aesthetic. Fenders clogged with mud. Every gram mattered. Every design choice pointed toward a single operational reality: speed through impossible terrain. On the 8th of December, 1941, at 0417 hours, the first bicycles hit Malayan roads outside Kota Baru. The after-action report from the 5th Division is remarkably bureaucratic about it. Bicycle infantry advance commenced as per schedule. By the 15th of January, 1942, a maintenance sweep outside Kuala Lumpur, we covered a bicycle with a bent spoke, logged into evidence as item KL447. That bicycle had traveled roughly 600 kilometers in 38 days. Its rider had likely carried full combat load: rifle, ammunition, rations, and personal kit. The spoke didn't break from defect, it broke from use. That small piece of metal, now sitting in a Malaysian military archive, represents the mechanical reality underneath the grand narrative of invasion. Soldiers rode bicycles until the bicycles broke. Then they took new ones from supply dumps and kept riding. It strikes me as grimly ironic that most of these bicycles weren't Japanese at all. Manufacturers' marks on surviving frames show Raleigh, BSA, and Rudge Whitworth, British brands, exported to Asia before the war as part of the colonial trade network. The empire was invaded, in part, by its own exports. Britain sold the bicycles, Japan bought them, modified them, and rode them all the way to Singapore. I've seen exactly 3 mentions of this in the historical literature, all in footnotes. It's the kind of detail that doesn't fit the narrative of technological superiority or exotic Eastern cunning. It's just commerce turned into conquest. Metal remembering nothing, serving anyone. The aftermath is measured not in dramatic battle reports, but in maintenance logs. By February of 1942, Japanese repair depots in Singapore were processing more than 200 damaged bicycles per day. Tires wore out. Chains snapped. Frames cracked under stress. But the system kept functioning because the logistics had been thought through in November, in that Saigon warehouse, when Kawamura changed 4,200 to 6,000. That margin of 2,000 bicycles wasn't excess. It was the calculated buffer for attrition. For every bicycle that made it to Singapore intact, 0.7 bicycles were abandoned, cannibalized, or destroyed en route. The math worked. The invasion succeeded. And British commanders, reading the intelligence summaries that dismissed coolie transport, never understood what was coming until it had already arrived. The weight of the defeat can be measured in what wasn't there. 0 anti-bicycle obstacles prepared along the Malayan roads. No consideration of how to defend against high-mobility light infantry operating without fuel lines. The British built their defensive doctrine around stopping motor columns, not stopping men on bicycles moving at night through rubber plantations. The fortifications existed. The doctrine existed. But the imagination failed. Looking at those requisition forms now, knowing what followed, I find it almost unbearable how visible the preparation was. The intelligence existed. The photographs existed. The tonnage reports existed. But institutional arrogance transformed evidence into noise. They saw bicycles and thought, primitive. They should have thought, fast. The final detail sits in a post-war investigation file, declassified in the 1990s. A British logistics officer, interviewed in 1947, was asked if pre-war intelligence had indicated Japanese bicycle deployment. His answer, verbatim from the transcript: "There were mentions, yes, but bicycles weren't considered a serious military capability. One doesn't fortify against delivery boys. One doesn't fortify against delivery boys." That sentence, more than any battle report, explains why Singapore fell. The delivery boys arrived. They carried rifles. And the empire that built the bicycles discovered, too late, that mobility doesn't care about prestige. It only cares about arriving first. The ledger from November 18, 1941, sits in an archive now, a quiet document proving that defeat can be written in pencil, one requisition amendment at a time. Chapter 2. The Cement That Didn't Arrive. The 3rd of March, 1941, Singapore. A carbon copy invoice moves through the Public Works Department, routine paperwork in a colony built on paperwork. The line item reads, 40,000 tons Portland cement, requisitioned for defensive fortifications, Northern Sector. Someone stamps it, someone files it, and then someone, a faceless administrator in the Colonial Office in London, 1,700 miles away, makes a decision. The cement is diverted. Destination, Hong Kong. Priority, Colonial Office Directive 17, 2nd of February, 1941. The smudge over the word Singapore is still visible on the document, preserved now in the National Archives at Kew. That smudge is heavier than 40,000 tons. It's the weight of what didn't arrive. I've spent more time than I care to admit staring at shipping manifests from 1941, trying to understand the mentality behind these decisions. The cement existed. The ships existed. The need existed. But Hong Kong was visible, a symbol, a crown colony that mattered to London in ways Singapore never quite did. Singapore worked. It generated revenue, processed rubber and tin, kept the trade routes functioning. It was infrastructure, not identity. And so when resources were scarce, when choices had to be made about where to send limited supplies, Singapore received the leftovers. The requisition for 40,000 tons became a request. The request became a maybe. The maybe became nothing. And the men responsible for fortifying the island were left holding forms that promised materials that would never arrive. The engineering requirements weren't theoretical. In January of 1941, Public Works Department engineers submitted detailed surveys of Singapore's northern defensive positions, the sectors most exposed to potential attack from Malaya. Their calculations were precise. Minimum reinforcement standards for pillboxes required secondary steel and concrete construction rated to withstand sustained field artillery. The math was simple. Singapore's existing fortifications used approximately 37,240 tons of cement, installed between 1936 and 1941. The engineers calculated that minimum adequacy, not optimal, just adequate, required 89,000 tons total. The gap was 51,760 tons. That translated to 4,313 bunkers operating below structural specification. Not theoretical bunkers. Real positions with real men inside them, positions that would face real shells. A test case sits in the archives, rarely mentioned. September of 1941, Pulau Ubin, a small island off Singapore's northeast coast. Engineers conducted a controlled demolition test on a newly constructed bunker, part of the Northern Defensive Network. Standard practice: build it, test it, verify it can withstand the punishment it's designed for. The bunker collapsed, not under sustained artillery fire, under the test charges. The inspection report was classified immediately. The language is careful, bureaucratic, designed to avoid panic. Structural integrity below projected resilience. Recommend comprehensive review of concrete mixing ratios and curing protocols. Translation: the fortifications weren't strong enough, and everyone involved knew it. The report includes a handwritten note in the margin. Unsigned. Tropical heat accelerates curing defects. Existing structures likely compromised. That note never generated action. It generated a filing reference. What fascinates me about this period is the gap between knowledge and response. The engineers knew. They documented their concerns in meeting minutes, in technical reports, in requisition forms that grew increasingly desperate in tone. But knowledge without authority is just anxiety. The cement that did arrive went to priority projects, the naval base, the airfields, infrastructure that London considered essential. The northern fortifications, the land-facing defenses that would actually matter when the Japanese came south through Malaya, those were secondary, expendable even. One engineering survey from June of 1941 shows that 60% of northern pillboxes lacked secondary reinforcement. 60%. That's not an oversight. That's systematic under-resourcing. That's institutional failure measured in missing rebar. The technical failure mechanism is worth understanding because it explains why the fortifications didn't just underperform, they failed catastrophically. Unreinforced concrete in tropical conditions develops microfractures at a rate of roughly 0.3 millimeters per year. Doesn't sound like much, but the thread tolerances for structural integrity in these designs were 0.5 millimeters. By 1942, bunkers built in 1938 had degraded to approximately 40% of their design specification. The concrete was there. It looked solid, but the internal structure was compromised, weakened by heat and humidity and time. When Japanese shells hit these positions in February of 1942, they didn't need sustained bombardment. They penetrated in minutes. 12 minutes, according to the after-action report from the 2nd Battalion, Gordon Highlanders. 12 minutes from first impact to structural failure. Men died inside bunkers that were supposed to protect them, killed by their own collapsing fortifications. The human dimension of this sits in a personnel file that almost nobody's read. William Havers, Senior Civil Engineer, Public Works Department. Between January and July of 1941, Havers submitted 17 separate reports warning that defensive fortifications were structurally inadequate. 17, each one more urgent than the last, each one ignored. In July of 1941, Havers was transferred to Fiji for administrative inefficiency. That's the official reason. The real reason, obvious in the correspondence, was that he wouldn't shut up about the cement. He kept pushing, kept filing reports, kept insisting that Singapore's defenses were a facade. And for that, he was removed. Not because he was wrong, because he was right, loudly. And the colonial administration couldn't tolerate that level of honesty. Havers survived the war in Fiji. Singapore's defenders weren't so fortunate. The aftermath is visible in the ruins. Photographs from February 1942 show bunkers with walls cracked open like eggshells, concrete reduced to rubble by artillery that shouldn't have been able to penetrate. Japanese post-battle reports express surprise at how easily the fortifications collapsed. They'd expected harder fighting. They got structures that failed on contact. The cement shortage didn't just weaken Singapore's defenses. It created the illusion of defense while delivering none of the substance. Soldiers fought from positions they believed were hardened. They weren't. The maps showed fortifications. The ground showed concrete shells waiting to collapse. And the requisition forms, filed and stamped and diverted, sat in London archives, evidence of decisions that killed men 18 months later. To me, the most damning document isn't a battle report or a casualty list. It's a cost-benefit analysis from March of 1941, found in colonial office files, examining whether to authorize the full cement requisition for Singapore. The conclusion? Expenditure not justified given uncertain threat timeline and post-war reconstruction cost considerations. Post-war reconstruction costs. They were worried about how much it would cost to rebuild fortifications after the war, so they didn't build them properly before the war. That calculation assumes British victory, assumes Singapore would never actually face sustained attack, assumes the empire's dominance was so total that adequate defenses weren't necessary. The arithmetic was flawless. The assumptions were fatal. And when the Japanese arrived, riding bicycles down roads that shouldn't have supported invasion, they encountered fortifications built by accountants who believed cement was too expensive to waste on a war that would never come. The cement that didn't arrive weighs nothing now. It was never mixed, never poured, never set. But its absence is measurable in the gap between what should have been and what was. 40,000 tons diverted, 51,000 tons short, 4,313 bunkers below spec, 60% of northern positions inadequate, 12 minutes to structural failure, and one engineer transferred to Fiji for telling the truth. The numbers are small until you multiply them by lives. Then they become unbearable. Somewhere in a warehouse in Hong Kong, that diverted cement probably sat unused, a strategic reserve for a city that would fall in 18 days. Singapore held out for 70. The cement wouldn't have saved it. But it might have made the collapse harder, bloodier, slower. It might have given the defenders something real to fight from, instead of illusions of concrete that crumbled at the first test. The invoice with the smudge over Singapore is just paper. But paper, sometimes, is all that stands between adequacy and catastrophe. And in March of 1941, someone decided Singapore wasn't worth the expense. The price came due in February. The empire paid in bodies. Chapter 3. Percival's Margin Notes. The 19th of November, 1941. Singapore. Late evening. General Arthur Percival sits at his desk in Fort Canning, the colonial headquarters overlooking the city. Before him lies a staff manual, The Defense of Fortress Singapore, published earlier that year, a bound document outlining defensive doctrine for the island. Page 47. The printed text reads, "Northern approach adequately covered by 15-inch batteries." Percival picks up a pencil. In the margin, in his careful handwriting, he writes, "If ships approach. Landward? 1911-41." The question mark is small, precise. The doubt is enormous. That margin note, preserved in the Imperial War Museum's collection, is the clearest evidence we have that Percival saw the defeat coming and couldn't say it out loud. When I first encountered Percival's annotated manual during research at the IWM, I'll admit I expected something different. The popular narrative paints him as either incompetent or delusional, a commander out of touch with reality. But the margin notes tell a different story. They're the marks of a man who understood exactly what was wrong and was institutionally paralyzed to fix it. The 15-inch guns pointed seaward because everyone assumed the threat would come from the sea. Naval assault, battleships. The entire defensive architecture of Singapore was built around that assumption. Percival's note, "Landward," is him calculating the obvious. If the Japanese come down through Malaya, if they attack from the north, those guns are useless. They can't traverse inland. They're fortress artillery, not field pieces. Magnificent weapons pointing the wrong direction, and he knew it. 3 months before the invasion began. The mathematics of his isolation are worth examining. On the 15th of December, 1941, 1 week after the war in the Pacific began, Percival met with Governor Shenton Thomas to discuss defensive preparations. The meeting minutes, filed in Colonial Office records, show Percival raising concerns about northern defenses, lack of air cover, and insufficient troop strength. Thomas's response, documented in the minutes, "Defeatist assessments undermine morale and serve no constructive purpose." Defeatist. That word appears 3 times in the colonial correspondence about Percival during this period. Not incorrect, not mistaken. Defeatist. The institutional logic was clear. If Percival couldn't be optimistic, he was the problem, not the situation. The Empire didn't want accurate assessments, it wanted reassurance. And Percival, trained to operate within institutional hierarchy, provided what was expected in official communications while documenting his private doubts in the margins of manuals that no one else would read. His diary entry from the 28th of January, 1942, is one of the most quietly devastating documents I've encountered. 3 sentences. Malaya lost. Singapore follows. I have said this to no one. By this point, British forces had retreated down the entire Malayan Peninsula. The Johor Causeway, the narrow land bridge to Singapore Island, had been inadequately demolished. Japanese forces were massing on the northern shore. Percival could see the endgame. But to say it, to officially declare that Singapore was indefensible, would be to admit the Empire's greatest fortress was a fiction. So he wrote it in his diary and said nothing in his reports. That gap between private knowledge and public performance is the space where Percival lived. It's also where Singapore died. The technical reality he was wrestling with appears throughout the manual's annotations. On page 63, the printed text states, "Air superiority ensures defensive flexibility." Percival's note, 347 aircraft minimum, have 141 as of 1st January. A.R. A.R. His initials. The calculation isn't approximate. He knew exactly how many aircraft Singapore needed to maintain air defense. 347 operational planes. He also knew exactly how many were actually available. 141. The deficit was 206 aircraft, representing approximately 4,120 tons of aluminum, engine parts, and support equipment that the Empire couldn't or wouldn't provide. That level of precision in his private notes suggests a man constantly calculating the gap between what doctrine required and what reality permitted. And the gap was unbridgeable. What strikes me most about Percival's situation is how thoroughly he was trapped by the mythology of Singapore itself. The phrase, "Fortress Singapore," wasn't just propaganda, it was institutional identity. London believed it, the Colonial Office believed it, the governor believed it. To question it publicly was to question the empire's competence, the strategic assumptions underpinning Britain's entire Pacific defense structure. So Percival did what institutional officers do. He raised concerns through proper channels, documented his assessments, and when those were rejected, he carried out his orders. His margin notes are evidence of intellectual honesty. They're also evidence of moral cowardice, depending on how you weigh the duty to obey versus the duty to refuse. He saw disaster approaching. He had the authority to make noise, to resign in protest, to force a confrontation. He chose compliance. Whether that makes him tragic or culpable is a debate historians will continue having. I lean toward tragic, but I understand the other view. The geometry of defeat appears in his personal calculations. Percival sketched angles of fire in the margins of page 79, calculating how Japanese artillery positioned along the Johor coast would have enfilade fire across British positions on Singapore's northern shore. His math was accurate to within 2 degrees. He drew the lines, measured the distances, and concluded that howitzers at 1 degree 31 minutes north latitude could cover 73% of defensive positions. He knew where the shells would land before they were fired. That kind of anticipatory analysis requires both technical competence and the willingness to imagine defeat in granular detail. Most commanders can't do that. It's psychologically unbearable to map your own destruction. Percival did it anyway, and then he followed orders to defend positions he knew were already lost. His final annotation appears on page 112, dated the 10th of February, 1942. The printed text discusses sustained defensive operations utilizing interior lines and strategic reserves. Percival's note is 2 words: what reserves? By this point, Singapore was under siege. Water supplies were failing. Ammunition was dwindling. The civilian population was trapped and terrified. The manual's confident assertions about strategic depth and reserve formations were revealed as fiction. There were no reserves. There were exhausted men in crumbling positions, facing an enemy that had outmaneuvered, outfought, and outlasted every British defensive plan. And Percival knew it. He'd known it since November, when he first wrote "landward" in the margin and realized the fortress was facing the wrong direction. On the 15th of February, 1942, at 0830 hours, Percival signed the surrender document. He used the same fountain pen he'd used for the margin notes. Museum records catalog it as item IWM 82441. That detail probably doesn't matter strategically, but it matters symbolically. The same instrument that documented private doubt now formalized public defeat. Percival carried the Union Jack to the Ford factory and surrendered 80,000 men, the largest capitulation in British military history. His margin notes went with him into captivity, tucked into his personal effects, evidence of a mind that saw the collapse coming and couldn't prevent it. After the war, he published memoirs that claimed he consistently warned his superiors. Churchill's papers suggest Percival provided reassurances in official cables. Both things are true. He warned in margins. He reassured in telegrams. The question historians wrestle with is which one mattered more, and whether a different choice, louder warnings, public resignation, institutional rebellion, could have changed anything. Probably not. The cement wasn't there. The aircraft weren't there. The political will to actually defend Singapore wasn't there. But the margin notes remain, quiet marks of a man who knew the truth and couldn't speak it. The pencil marks are fading now, 90-some years old, graphite slowly disappearing from paper. But the questions they asked, landward? What reserves? Those haven't faded at all. They're still being asked in military academies, wherever commanders study the difference between what doctrine promises and what reality delivers. And the answer, written in Percival's careful hand, remains the same. Sometimes you see disaster coming, and the only thing you can do is document it. The margin isn't big enough for salvation, only observation, only truth that arrives too quietly to matter. Chapter 4. The Missing Air War. The 19th of December, 1941. Sembawang Airfield, Singapore. Morning. The maintenance log for Buffalo fighter aircraft, serial number BR447, shows a red tag stamped across the status column. The notation reads, "Propeller governor seized, humidity, no replacement, cannibalized." Below that, in different handwriting, 6th this week. 6 aircraft, 1 week. Not lost in combat, lost to moisture. The air war over Singapore wasn't won or lost in dogfights. It was surrendered in maintenance tents where British engineering met tropical reality and dissolved at a measurable rate. 3.2 millimeters of corrosion per month. I need to be clear about what happened here because the mythology obscures the mechanics. The standard narrative describes Japanese air superiority, skilled pilots overwhelming outmatched defenders, the dramatic collapse of RAF Malaya. All true, but incomplete. The deeper truth is that British aircraft failed mechanically before they failed tactically. An engineering report from the 22nd of December 1941 documents that 64% of RAF aircraft were grounded due to mechanical failure, not combat damage. 64%. That's not attrition from battle. That's systemic mechanical collapse. The Japanese didn't need to shoot down planes that couldn't take off. And the reason they couldn't take off was humidity, heat, and a complete mismatch between British temperate climate engineering and equatorial operational environment. The technical failure mechanism is specific and predictable. Bristol Hercules radial engines, used in many RAF aircraft stationed in Singapore, employed magnesium alloy cylinder heads, standard design for European operations. In temperate climates, the alloy performs beautifully. Lightweight, heat dissipative, durable. In Singapore's constant 85% plus humidity, magnesium oxidizes rapidly. The chemistry is straightforward. Magnesium plus water plus oxygen yields magnesium hydroxide, a flaky white coating that forms on metal surfaces. Rate of oxidation in tropical conditions? 0.4 millimeters per month. Thread tolerances for cylinder head bolts? 0.5 millimeters. After 4 months of Singapore's climate, critical engine components literally no longer fit their design specifications. Bolts that should torque to precise tensions couldn't hold. Seals that should maintain compression didn't. And engines that should produce 1,200 horsepower produced nothing but failure reports. The human cost of this appears in after-action reports that are almost unbearable to read. On the 10th of December 1941, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse were sunk off the Malayan coast by Japanese aircraft. The ships requested air cover. None arrived. The official explanation: aircraft unserviceable. The loss report is more specific. Of 18 Brewster Buffalo fighters allocated for fleet air defense, 14 were grounded with mechanical faults. 4 aircraft attempted launch. 2 aborted due to engine failure during takeoff. 2 reached the area too late to engage. The ships sank. 842 men died. The aircraft that might have saved them sat on the ground with seized propellers and corroded cylinder heads, victims of chemistry that no amount of courage could overcome. When I cross-reference RAF maintenance logs with Japanese combat reports from this period, a pattern emerges that contradicts the air superiority narrative. Japanese pilots flying sorties over Singapore between December 1941 and January 10, 1942, reported encountering British aircraft in only 43% of missions. The other 57% encountered no opposition at all. Not because the British chose not to engage, because there were no functional aircraft to send up. Japanese records describe unopposed reconnaissance flights, bombing runs with 0 interception. Air superiority achieved not through combat, but through absence. The British weren't defeated in the air. They were defeated on the ground, in maintenance bays, by the slow chemical degradation of components designed for different weather. The spare parts crisis compounds the technical failure. Between September of 1941 and January of 1942, RAF Singapore received exactly 847 tons of spare parts and maintenance supplies. Engineering logistics estimates, calculated based on tropical operational tempo and known failure rates, indicated that 6,200 tons were required for sustained operations. The deficit was 5,353 tons. That 86% shortfall represented more than missing equipment. It represented mechanical surrender. Without replacement parts, maintenance crews did what they could. They cannibalized. Take working components from aircraft BR-447 and install them in BR-392. Keep one plane flying by sacrificing another. The log entries track this process in meticulous detail. Each cannibalization documented, each aircraft slowly reduced from operational to parts donor to scrap. By late January, Sembawang's flight line resembled a junkyard more than an airbase. There's a bitter irony embedded in the aircraft types deployed to Singapore that's worth examining. The Brewster Buffalo, the primary fighter defending Malaya, had been rejected by the United States Navy as unsuitable for Pacific operations in 1939. The U.S. analysis was blunt. Inadequate climb rate, poor high-altitude performance, maintenance-intensive. Britain bought them anyway, second-hand aircraft that American forces didn't want, and shipped them to Singapore as first-line defense. To be fair, Britain was desperate for aircraft in 1941, taking anything that could fly. But deploying rejected designs to the Pacific theater while knowing they'd already failed American suitability tests represents either astonishing optimism or institutional delusion. The Buffalo's mechanical failure rate in Singapore was predictable because it had already been documented in American service. Britain ignored that evidence and paid for it in unserviceable aircraft. The final operational Hurricane, serial number V7476, flew its last sortie on the 10th of January, 1942. The pilot's report describes engine roughness, loss of power, heavy vibration. He landed successfully. Ground crew attempted repairs. The engine couldn't be restarted. Inspection revealed extensive internal corrosion, cylinder compression below minimum operational threshold, magneto timing erratic. The aircraft was listed as permanently unserviceable pending major overhaul. No overhaul facilities existed in Singapore. The Hurricane never flew again. It sat on the tarmac through the siege, through the surrender, and was eventually destroyed by British forces to prevent capture. One of the last functional fighters in Singapore, killed by humidity and the absence of repair infrastructure. The loss report is 2 pages. The technical failure analysis is 11 pages. The 11 pages tell the real story. On the 8th of February 1942, Tengah Airfield was abandoned as Japanese forces advanced across Singapore Island. Demolition teams destroyed 27 aircraft on the ground before retreating. Most were marked unserviceable in the final status reports. Not destroyed by Japanese bombs, not shot down in combat, just broken, corroded, mechanically failed machines that represented the collapse of British air power through entirely predictable engineering mismatch. Looking at those final maintenance logs now, I find myself frustrated by how preventable this was. Environmental qualification testing wasn't unknown in 1941. The principles were established. Test equipment in the conditions where it will operate. Verify that components can withstand heat, humidity, dust, salt. But that testing cost time and money. And Britain in 1941 had neither to spare. So they sent temperate climate engines into equatorial conditions and called it air power. The engines disagreed. They corroded, they seized, they failed. And Singapore fell, in part, because magnesium oxide forms at 0.4 millimeters per month and thread tolerances are 0.5 millimeters, and that gap, 1/10 of a millimeter, was just large enough to fit an empire's defeat. The missing air war wasn't missing. It was there in the logs, in the red tags, in the seized propellers and corroded cylinder heads. It was there in the maintenance officers' reports begging for parts that never came. It was there in the pilots who wanted to fight but couldn't because their aircraft had chemically degraded beneath the threshold of functionality. What was missing was the recognition that war is metallurgy, that battles are won by logistics, that air superiority means nothing if your planes can't start. The mythology remembers brave pilots and enemy aces. The maintenance logs remember humidity and corrosion, and the slow, predictable failure of components designed for a different war in a different climate. Both are true. Only one explains why Singapore's air defenses collapsed before the invasion truly began. The propeller governor on BR-447, seized by moisture, sits in storage now somewhere, if it still exists at all. A small mechanical part, a predictable failure, and one more piece of evidence that empires fall not just through grand strategic errors, but through the accumulated weight of 10,000 small, measurable, entirely preventable technical failures that somehow, impossibly, weren't prevented at all. Chapter 5. The Water Engineer's Testimony. The 13th of February, 1942, Singapore, evening. Chief Water Engineer Angus Rose stands in front of a wall-mounted schematic of the island's water distribution system, briefing General Percival on a crisis that won't appear in the battle reports. The schematic shows 3 reservoirs, McRitchie, Pierce, Seletar, feeding a centralized pipe network with a single junction point at Woodley. Rose's handwriting marks the schematic in red ink. Reservoirs under artillery range. Pipes severed Woodley sector. Capacity, 17 hours at rationing. The calculation is dated 14/2/42, tomorrow's date, written today. Rose isn't predicting the future. He's documenting the inevitable. Singapore won't fall because the army breaks. It will fall because the water stops flowing. When I first encountered Rose's testimony at the 1946 war crimes trials, buried in supporting documentation, not the headline evidence, I realized how fundamentally the water crisis shaped the surrender decision. The trial focused on atrocities, on prisoner treatment, on the brutality that followed defeat. But Rose's testimony reveals what preceded defeat, an infrastructure crisis so catastrophic that continued resistance would have meant civilian mass death from disease within 72 hours. Percival didn't surrender because his troops couldn't fight. He surrendered because fighting meant watching 1 million civilians die of cholera and dysentery, while the Empire's fortress proved incapable of delivering the most basic human necessity. Rose's engineering calculations made surrender rational. Understanding those calculations requires understanding the hydraulic geometry of Singapore's water system and how completely it failed. The system's design was efficient but fragile. 3 reservoirs in Singapore's central catchment area collected rainfall, fed by the island's network of rivers and streams. From the reservoirs, water moved through pump stations to a central distribution hub at Woodley, then out to the city's various sectors through a radial pipe network. Elegant design. Single point of failure. On the 10th of February, 1942, Japanese artillery began ranging on Woodley. The first shells missed, the next rounds corrected. By the evening of the 10th, Woodley pumping station had been hit multiple times. Damage assessment showed severed mains, destroyed pump housing, electrical systems offline. Rose's diary from that evening, archived with his personal papers, contains a single sentence: "Woodley is gone. We have hours, not days." The mathematics of survival are brutally simple. Singapore's civilian population in February 1942 was approximately 1,100,000 people. Minimum daily water requirement for survival: 11.3 liters per person per day. That's drinking water plus basic sanitation, calculated at bare subsistence levels. Total daily requirement: 12,400 tons of water. With Woodley destroyed, deliverable capacity dropped to approximately 2,100 tons per day, enough for 186,000 people. The deficit meant 914,000 people without access to water within 36 hours. That's not a military problem. That's a public health catastrophe. Rose understood this immediately. He also understood that explaining it to military commanders meant translating hydraulic engineering into language that would convey urgency without inducing panic. He failed. Or rather, the urgency was understood but couldn't be fixed. The meeting on the 13th of February between Rose and Percival is documented in War Office records. Rose presented his calculations: 17 hours of water remaining at emergency rationing levels, after which delivery capacity would fall to 0. No bypass routes existed. No alternative distribution system existed. The reservoirs were full, water existed, but without functioning pipes and pump stations, it couldn't reach the population. Percival asked the question that military commanders have to ask: can repairs be made? Rose's answer, recorded in the minutes: not under artillery fire, not in the time available. The pipes are gone. The pipes are gone. 4 words that meant siege warfare was impossible. You can hold a city without food for weeks. Without water, you have days. Without clean water in tropical heat, with 1 million people crowded into a shrinking perimeter, you have hours before disease outbreaks that will kill more efficiently than enemy action. What fascinates me about this crisis is how it inverted the strategic calculus. Military doctrine focuses on ammunition, fuel, troop strength, fortification integrity. Water is assumed. It's infrastructure, background noise, the stuff that just works. Until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, everything else becomes irrelevant. Percival had ammunition. He had defensible positions. He had troops willing to fight. But he didn't have water, and without water, continued resistance meant choosing between military honor and mass civilian death. The choice wasn't theoretical. On the 14th of February, Japanese forces dropped leaflets over Singapore's civilian sectors. Surrender, or we shell the reservoirs. The leaflet is preserved in the British Library's collections. The threat was probably empty. Destroying the reservoirs would have made occupying Singapore harder for the Japanese. But the threat worked because it was believable. Because Rose's briefing had already made clear how vulnerable the water system was. Rose's testimony at the 1946 trial includes a moment that's rarely quoted but essential. The prosecutor asked whether water shortage was the decisive factor in surrender. Rose's answer: I told General Percival we had 1 day. The pipes were severed. The pumps were destroyed. We had storage capacity for perhaps 18 hours at emergency rationing. After that, epidemic. He asked me specifically, how long? I said none. The pipes are gone. He surrendered the next morning. None. Not much, not barely any. None. Zero functional water delivery capacity. The city was already dying of thirst. Continuing to fight meant accelerating that death into epidemic. Percival's choice was between surrender with 80,000 prisoners of war or continued resistance with 1 million civilian corpses, and still, inevitably, surrender once disease made organized defense impossible. The technical details of the failure reveal how fragile urban warfare infrastructure really is. The Woodley Junction wasn't a fortified position. It was a civilian utility hub, concrete housing for pipes and pumps, never designed to withstand military action. One 380mm shell, standard Japanese field artillery, was sufficient to sever the main trunk line. There was no redundancy. Rose's 1939 proposal for a bypass system, which would have provided alternate routing in case of mainline failure, had requested 12 miles of additional piping at a cost of £47,000. £47,000. Less than the cost of a single Bristol Beaufighter aircraft. The proposal was rejected as non-essential expenditure. That rejection meant Singapore's water system had a single critical node, and when that node failed, the entire system failed. £47,000. 12 miles of pipe. That's what adequate redundancy would have cost. Instead, it cost an empire. The aftermath appears in Rose's post-war life, which is mostly forgotten. He survived Changi prison camp. He testified at the war crimes trials. He returned to Britain and worked as a consulting engineer until his retirement. He never published his account of Singapore's water crisis. The testimony exists because prosecutors needed technical evidence for war crimes charges related to civilian conditions. Rose provided it. But he didn't seek attention, didn't write memoirs, didn't become a public figure. His papers, donated to an engineering archive after his death, contained technical drawings, hydraulic calculations, and one personal letter from 1948 where he writes, "I think about those pipes more than the war. We built a city without redundancy and called it a fortress. The fortress had one pipe. I knew where it was, so did the Japanese." The letter isn't addressed to anyone. It's just Rose, alone, thinking about pipes. To me, Rose represents a category of historical figure that rarely gets attention. The technical expert who understands that war is infrastructure, who sees defeat in engineering terms rather than tactical terms, and who carries the knowledge that disaster was preventable if only someone had spent the money on the boring necessities. 12 miles of pipe, 47,000 pounds. That's not dramatic. It's not heroic. It's just sensible engineering. But empires don't fall dramatically. They fall because someone decided redundancy was too expensive, because backup systems seemed wasteful in peacetime, because the boring technical details that engineers worried about didn't seem important until the shells started falling and the pipes broke and 1 million people had 17 hours of water left. Rose saw it coming. He calculated it precisely, and when it happened exactly as he'd predicted, he testified about it in a war crimes trial, and then went home and never talked about it again. The pipes are still gone. The calculations remain in the archives. And Singapore's surrender, understood correctly, wasn't military defeat. It was hydraulic failure. The fortress didn't break. It ran dry. Chapter 6. The Diary of the Last Patrol. The 28th of January, 1942. Layang, Malaya. 0430 hours. Lieutenant Hugh Winstanley, 2nd Battalion Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, writes in his diary by the light of a shielded torch. The entry is in pencil, the handwriting cramped. Ordered to hold junction, no sign of promised support. 0620, Japs flanking. We ran, that's the truth of it. The diary is archived now at the National Army Museum in London. The truth of it. 5 words that cut through 70 years of official histories describing strategic withdrawals and fighting retreats. Winstanley's platoon didn't withdraw, they ran. And he wrote it down because the truth mattered more than the mythology, even when the truth was humiliating. I need to acknowledge what this diary represents before analyzing it. This isn't a sanitized after-action report written for commanders or historians. This is a 23-year-old officer documenting his own fear, his unit's collapse, the gap between doctrine and reality. Reading it now feels like an intrusion. These are private thoughts never meant for publication. But Winstanley's family donated the diary to the museum after his death in 1987, and it's become essential evidence for understanding what the Malayan retreat actually looked like at squad level. The official war diaries describe defensive positions, tactical withdrawals, orderly repositioning. Winstanley describes panic, abandonment, and the specific mechanics of how trained soldiers decide survival matters more than orders. Both accounts are true. Only one is honest about what truth costs. The operational context appears in the war diary of the 2nd Argylls, which provides the official version. On the 28th of January, 1942, Winstanley's platoon was ordered to establish a blocking position at the Layang Road junction, delaying Japanese advance elements to allow the main force to cross the Johor Strait to Singapore Island. Support was promised, artillery on call, armored cars for mobile defense, and relief by a fresh company within 4 hours. None of it arrived. Winstanley's diary entry for 0620 hours notes, support deadline passed. Road empty both directions. Can hear Japanese engines northeast. The promised help wasn't late. It wasn't coming. Winstanley and his platoon were alone, holding a position they'd been told was temporary, but was beginning to feel permanent, listening to enemy vehicles getting closer. What happened next is described in 2 versions. The official war diary states, Layang position withdrawn 0700 hours following enemy flanking movement. Unit successfully disengaged and moved to secondary positions. Winstanley's diary. 0740. Japs visible both flanks. Sergeant Cairns said hold. I said run. We ran. Lost formation, lost contact, just running. Reached coast by 1700. 11 men missing. Lost formation. That's the phrase that matters. Military units operate through structure, squads, platoons, companies, chains of command. Lost formation means the structure dissolved. Individual men running for their lives, no longer a unit, just survivors trying to reach safety. The 11 missing men weren't casualties in the conventional sense. They got separated. Maybe they drowned crossing the strait. Maybe they surrendered. Maybe they died alone in the jungle. Winstanley never saw them again. The diary entry from the 29th of January describes finding an abandoned British supply dump. Enough petrol for a battalion, just left there. Crates of ammunition, medical supplies, all intact. No demolition, no guards, just abandoned. This detail appears nowhere in official records, which makes sense. Admitting that functioning supplies were simply left behind contradicts the narrative of organized retreat. But it aligns with other accounts from the Malayan campaign. Repeated instances of supply dumps, equipment caches, even artillery pieces abandoned intact as units retreated faster than demolition teams could keep up. Winstanley's tone is bitter. We're running out of bullets while sitting next to crates we left for the Japanese. Someone should account for this. Someone should have. No one did. The crossing of the Johor Strait appears in the diary entry for the 30th of January. Night crossing by sampan, water rough. Lost 11 men, drowned or shot. Sergeant Cairns tried to swim back for rifles, didn't surface. This is the nightmare of tactical retreat, losing men not to combat, but to chaos. The strait is less than a mile wide at its narrowest point. In calm conditions, it's swimmable. But in darkness, under sporadic fire, with exhausted men carrying equipment, that mile becomes lethal. Cairns, Winstanley mentions him 3 times in earlier entries as a steady NCO, reliable under pressure, tried to swim back for abandoned rifles because soldiers are trained to never leave weapons for the enemy. He drowned. The diary doesn't speculate about whether the decision was brave or stupid. It just records the fact. Cans went into the water. Cans didn't come out. The final entry from this period, dated the 31st of January, is the one I keep returning to. Arrived on Singapore Island. Mustered 394 men present. Started campaign with 847. 453 casualties. Battalion adjutant says 87 killed in action, rest listed missing, straggling, or detached. Missing, straggling, or detached. Polite terms for we don't know where they are. We are beaten. I don't know why we pretend otherwise. 453 casualties, 87 killed in action. The math is stark. The other 366 men, 43% of the battalion's starting strength, simply disappeared into the chaos of retreat. Some died, some surrendered, some got lost. The records don't distinguish because the collapse was too complete to track individual fates. And Winstanley, reading those numbers, concluded what official histories wouldn't admit for years. The battalion was destroyed not by superior enemy tactics, but by systemic collapse. When I cross-reference Winstanley's account with Japanese records from the Malayan campaign, the details align. Japanese after-action reports describe encountering British forces that fought briefly, then withdrew rapidly, often abandoning equipment. They note surprise at the pace of retreat, confusion about whether they were facing an organized withdrawal or a rout. Winstanley answers that question, rout. Controlled in places, chaotic in others, but fundamentally a collapse of unit cohesion under pressure. The Japanese advanced at 40 kilometers per hour on roads because British forces couldn't maintain defensive positions long enough to organize coherent resistance. Once flanked, units either retreated or surrendered. There was no third option because the speed of Japanese movement, thank you bicycles, prevented the establishment of stable defensive lines. The technical detail that Winstanley provides about equipment abandonment is worth examining. He notes that by the 30th of January, his company had discarded 73% of heavy weapons, mortars, heavy machine guns, anti-tank rifles, because carrying them slowed retreat and they couldn't establish positions long enough to use them effectively. Doctrine called for heavy weapons to provide defensive firepower. Reality called for moving fast enough to avoid encirclement. The weapons were heavy, averaging 40 to 60 kilograms per system. Men carrying that weight couldn't maintain the 4-kilometer-per-hour retreat pace necessary to stay ahead of Japanese Type 95 tanks, which could do 40 kilometers per hour on roads. The math was simple. Carry the weapon and get captured, or drop the weapon and escape. They dropped the weapons. The official war diaries record this as equipment losses due to operational necessity. Winstanley calls it what it was: survival at the cost of capability. The diary stops abruptly on the 4th of February with a brief note. Digging in at Pasir Panjang. If this holds, we might last a week. If it doesn't, it's over. The position didn't hold. The Japanese landed on Singapore's northwest coast on the 8th of February, bypassing Pasir Panjang entirely. Winstanley and the survivors of the Second Argylls fought at various points during the siege, then surrendered on the 15th of February with the rest of the garrison. The diary entries from captivity are sporadic, increasingly terse. He survived Changi and the railway. He returned to Scotland after the war, worked as a schoolteacher, never published the diary. It was found among his effects in 1987 after his death, donated anonymously to the National Army Museum by family who understood its historical value but didn't want publicity. To me, the diary's importance isn't just in contradicting official narratives, though it does that decisively. It's in providing ground-level evidence that soldiers knew the Malayan campaign was lost long before commanders admitted it. Winstanley wrote, "We are beaten," on the 31st of January. Singapore didn't surrender until the 15th of February, 15 days later. For those 15 days, men fought and died defending positions that junior officers already understood were indefensible, following orders that came from a command structure unable to acknowledge the obvious. The diary is evidence of that gap between lived reality and official optimism. It's also evidence that some people, even in the middle of catastrophe, choose honesty over comfort. Winstanley could have written sanitized entries, could have framed the retreat as strategic, could have protected his own reputation. Instead, he wrote, "We ran, that's the truth of it." The truth of it. Not heroic, not comfortable, just true. The diary sits in an archive now, penciled pages fading slowly, proof that the fortress fell because the men defending it were human, exhausted, and eventually defeated by an enemy that moved faster than doctrine prepared them for. The 11 men missing from Winstanley's platoon have no marked graves. Their names appear on casualty lists under missing, straggling, or detached. The diary remembers them more honestly. They were there, then they weren't. And somewhere in the chaos between Layang and the Johor Strait, they stopped being soldiers and became statistics. The war moved on. The diary recorded what happened. And the truth, written in cramped pencil by torchlight, survived when almost everything else about that night dissolved into official euphemism. That survival matters. The record exists. The truth of it remains. Chapter 7. The Mathematics of Ammunition Expenditure. The 5th of February, 1942, Singapore Island. A logistics officer at Fort Canning completes Ammunition Expenditure Return Form AX44, routine paperwork in the machinery of siege. The form tracks a single 25-pounder field gun battery, issued 800 rounds on the 8th of December, 1941. Rounds fired by the 5th of February, 274. Rounds destroyed or abandoned, 526. Rounds remaining, 0. The stamp across the bottom reads, "Position evacuated 4242." That single form, preserved in Ordnance Corps records, tells a story that battle narratives miss. The guns fell silent not because they ran out of ammunition, but because they retreated before firing it. The mathematics of expenditure reveal what rhetoric conceals. British forces in Malaya barely fought. When I first started analyzing ammunition consumption data from the Malayan campaign, I expected the numbers to show desperate last stands, sustained defensive fires, ammunition exhausted through constant combat. The data shows the opposite. Small arms ammunition levels on the 15th of January 1942 stood at 67% of 8th December levels. Artillery ammunition consumption averaged 14 rounds per gun per day when doctrine called for 80 rounds per engagement. These aren't the statistics of fierce resistance. They're the statistics of brief contact followed by immediate withdrawal. The guns fired. The guns retreated. The ammunition, too heavy to carry, was either destroyed to prevent capture or simply abandoned intact. By the time Singapore surrendered, British forces had fired approximately 35% of their total ammunition stocks. The remaining 65% was blown up in place or captured by Japanese forces who were genuinely surprised by how much they inherited. The doctrinal baseline is essential for understanding what these numbers mean. British defensive doctrine for the period specified that a 25-pounder battery conducting sustained defensive fire should expend approximately 80 rounds per gun per engagement, with multiple engagements expected per day during active operations. Over a 70-day campaign, a single battery should theoretically fire thousands of rounds if constantly engaged. The actual average from Malayan artillery war diaries: 14 rounds per gun per day. Not per engagement, per day. That's 1 or 2 fire missions, typically brief ranging shots or harassing fire, followed by withdrawal orders. The pattern repeats across every unit I examined. Fire briefly, displace rapidly, abandon the ammunition you can't carry. The mathematical signature of retreat, not defense. The small arms data tells the same story from a different angle. Ordnance Corps reports from the 28th of January show ammunition stocks for rifle and light machine gun at levels that should have been impossible if British infantry were conducting sustained defensive operations. One detailed accounting from that date lists 340,000 rounds of .303 rifle ammunition in reserve stocks on Singapore Island. That's after 7 weeks of fighting down the entire Malayan Peninsula. For context, a single infantry battalion in sustained combat can expend 50,000 rounds in a week. The numbers don't match the narrative of constant fighting withdrawal. They match the reality that Winstanley described. Brief engagements, rapid retreat, minimal ammunition use because positions weren't held long enough to require sustained fire. What strikes me about these records is how thoroughly they contradict the mythology. Church's memoirs describe gallant stands and fierce resistance. The ammunition expenditure data shows that most batteries never exceeded 20% sustained fire rate, a rate consistent with meeting engagements and immediate withdrawal, not sustained defensive operations. I'm not suggesting British forces didn't fight. Individual actions were often fierce, sometimes heroic. But at the aggregate level, across the entire campaign, the mathematical signature is unmistakable. This was an army in retreat, conserving ammunition not for future battles, but because they weren't staying in one place long enough to fight the battles they were equipped for. The contrast between fired and destroyed ammunition reveals the tragedy in numerical form. British forces brought approximately 23,800 tons of artillery and small arms ammunition into Malaya before the campaign began. By the 15th of February, they'd fired roughly 8,300 tons, 35%. The remaining 15,500 tons were destroyed before surrender to prevent Japanese use. Think about what that means. 15,000 tons of ammunition blown up because retreating faster than you can fire creates a surplus that becomes a liability. Those weren't small demolitions. They were massive explosions that rocked Singapore in the final days before surrender. British forces destroying their own stockpiles while Japanese forces advanced into positions that British guns could have contested if the guns had stayed long enough to shoot. The diagnostic metric that convinces me these numbers represent institutional collapse rather than tactical choice is the comparison to doctrinal expenditure rates. For a defensive campaign of 70 days duration with the force levels Britain deployed, ammunition expenditure should have averaged 380 tons per day. Actual British expenditure averaged 118 tons per day, a 69% shortfall. That rate is consistent with what military logistics officers call meeting engagement and withdrawal operations. Brief contact, limited fire, rapid displacement. It's not consistent with sustained defense. The math proves what soldiers like Winstanley documented in diaries. Positions were abandoned before they could be properly defended, and the ammunition that should have been fired in defense was instead destroyed in retreat or captured intact by an enemy who couldn't believe how much the British left behind. The Japanese perspective on this appears in post-battle assessment reports that express genuine confusion about British ammunition stocks. Japanese ordnance officers conducting post-surrender inventories on Singapore Island documented approximately 14,700 tons of serviceable British ammunition captured intact or partially destroyed. Their reports note that much of it was still in original packing, never issued to frontline units. One Japanese logistics assessment, translated in post-war Allied intelligence summaries, states, "Ammunition stocks exceeded estimated British deployment requirements. Enemy forces appear to have retreated without utilizing available reserves." Retreated without utilizing available reserves. That's polite military language for, they ran away before shooting their guns. The human cost of this appears in the gap between capability and employment. British forces on Singapore Island on the 8th of February 1942 had sufficient ammunition to sustain defensive operations for weeks, potentially months. They had the material to fight. What they lacked was the will, the leadership, and the tactical coherence to stay in position long enough to use it. That's not cowardice. Exhausted men making rational decisions about survival aren't cowards. But it is defeat, and it's defeat measured in unfired shells and abandoned magazines. Every round that was blown up instead of fired represents a moment where retreat was chosen over resistance. Sometimes that choice was necessary. Sometimes it was the only option. But the aggregate mathematics suggest it became habitual, systemic, the default response to Japanese contact. The specific example that haunts me appears in the war diary of a field artillery regiment stationed at Bukit Timah on the 10th of February. The position came under Japanese infantry probe, not heavy assault, a probe. The battery commander requested permission to engage. Permission granted. The battery fired 43 rounds, forcing Japanese withdrawal. Effective defensive fire, exactly what the guns were there for. Then, 2 hours later, orders arrived to abandon the position and displace south. The battery complied, destroying 230 rounds they couldn't transport and leaving the position they'd successfully defended. The Japanese reoccupied it the next morning without opposition. That sequence, successful defense, ordered withdrawal, position lost, appears repeatedly in unit war diaries. The ammunition was there. The capability was there. The positions were defensible. But the strategic coherence to hold them was absent. To me, the ammunition expenditure data is more damning than battle reports because numbers don't lie the way narratives do. You can describe a retreat as strategic withdrawal or elastic defense, but you can't hide that you fired 35% of your ammunition and destroyed the rest. You can claim fierce resistance, but ammunition consumption rates prove whether guns fired sustainably or sporadically. The British fired sporadically, retreated constantly, and ended the campaign sitting on stockpiles they never used. That's not a logistical triumph, having enough supplies. That's a tactical failure, never staying in place long enough to employ them. The ammunition didn't run out. The will to use it did. And that's measurable, quantifiable, undeniable in the cold accounting of expenditure returns filed by logistics officers who couldn't spin the numbers the way commanders spun the narratives. The final irony sits in post-war records documenting Japanese use of captured British ammunition. Between February 1942 and August 1945, Japanese coastal defense batteries on Singapore Island fired British 25-pounder shells against Allied aircraft and ships. British ammunition, loaded into British guns that Japanese forces captured intact, fired back at Allied forces attempting to retake Southeast Asia. The shells British forces destroyed in February could have been fired in defense. Instead, they were either blown up or turned against their former owners. Material irony that cuts deeper than any tactical analysis. The ammunition that should have defended Singapore ended up defending Singapore's conquerors. The mathematics are simple, the implications are unbearable. The expenditure returns sit in archives, bureaucratic forms filled out by officers documenting defeat in columns and calculations. Rounds issued, rounds fired, rounds destroyed, rounds captured. The totals tell the truth that battle reports obscure. Singapore fell not because British forces ran out of ammunition. It fell because they ran out of reasons to stay and fight. The guns fell silent while still loaded. The silence was a choice, made 1,000 times across 70 days, calculated in the gap between how much was fired and how much was simply abandoned. The mathematics of expenditure become the mathematics of surrender. And the numbers, cold and precise, remember what the mythology forgets. The fortress had bullets. It just stopped shooting. Chapter 8. Alexandra Hospital, the atrocity as archive. The 14th of February, 1942. Alexandra Military Hospital, Singapore. 14 to 15 hours. A hospital admission form sits on a desk in Ward C, recording patient Private R. Morris, gunshot wound to the abdomen, admitted for emergency surgery. The handwriting is careful, methodical, the routine documentation of military medicine. Across the form, diagonally, is a boot print. The paper is stained dark brown, the color of old blood. The form was found under a body during post-war exhumations, catalogued as Trial Exhibit SIN 44. Physical evidence in a war crimes prosecution that would hang 2 men and haunt the survivors who lived to testify. The boot print is evidence. So is the blood. So is the precise timestamp, 1415. That's when routine medicine became massacre. I want to be clear about what this chapter examines, because the material is difficult and the methodology matters. This isn't an attempt to narrate horror for emotional impact. It's an analysis of how atrocity becomes evidence, how massacre becomes trial testimony, how memory becomes contested fact in a legal process that demands proof beyond witness accounts. The Alexandra Hospital massacre happened. That's not in dispute. What remains contested, what the 1946 trial grappled with, is exactly what happened, in what sequence, who gave orders, and whether survivors' accounts match the physical evidence exhumed 4 years after bodies were buried. The gap between lived trauma and evidentiary standards reveals how law processes horror and how difficult it is to prove atrocity when the dead can't testify. The sequence of events comes from multiple sources that don't entirely align. Lieutenant Colonel Craven, Royal Army Medical Corps, survived and testified. His account describes Japanese troops entering the hospital at approximately 1300 hours on the 14th of February. Bayonets fixed. No attempt at negotiation. The defense, during the trial, claimed Japanese soldiers had received fire from the hospital and were responding to combatants. British survivors stated unequivocally that no weapons were present, red crosses were clearly displayed, and medical staff attempted to indicate non-combatant status. The trial transcripts run to hundreds of pages, defense and prosecution presenting fundamentally incompatible versions of basic facts. Both sides had evidence. Both sides had witnesses. The contradictions couldn't be fully resolved because chaos doesn't produce clean narratives. The forensic evidence becomes crucial when witness testimony conflicts. Post-war exhumation teams, operating under British military authority in 1946, excavated suspected burial sites around Alexandra Hospital using grid coordinates provided by survivors. The methodology was systematic. Divide the area into numbered squares. Excavate methodically. Document findings with photographs and written descriptions. They found bodies. 52 could be identified through various means: dental records, uniform remnants, personal effects, hospital patient identification tags. The trial records list these identifications in appendices that read like inventories: name, rank, service number, cause of death determined from skeletal remains. Bayonet wounds are identifiable. Gunshot wounds are identifiable. The bones remember violence. What the forensic evidence couldn't determine was intent, sequence, or command responsibility. 52 bodies identified. Trial testimony mentioned 141 missing staff and patients. The gap of 89 people represents the evidentiary threshold: bodies never found, or found but unidentifiable, or buried elsewhere, or never buried at all. That gap became the defense's primary argument. If prosecution claims 141 dead, but evidence proves only 52, how reliable is the witness testimony? The prosecution's response: Mass graves in tropical conditions, 4 years of degradation, incomplete exhumation due to time and resource constraints. Both arguments have validity. The trial proceeded on the evidence available, knowing it was incomplete but judging it sufficient for conviction. The testimony of survivors provides detail that forensic evidence cannot. Craven described wards cleared at gunpoint, patients bayoneted in their beds, medical staff killed while attempting to surrender. His testimony is precise about times, locations, specific incidents he witnessed personally. Under cross-examination, defense counsel challenged his memory, his vantage point, his ability to distinguish individual Japanese soldiers in chaotic circumstances. Craven's answers are remarkably steady. "I was there. I saw this happen. I cannot identify which specific soldier did which specific act, but I can testify that Japanese troops killed patients and staff systematically over the course of several hours." The defense couldn't break his core testimony. They just contested the implications: systematic versus chaotic, ordered versus undisciplined troops acting without command authority. The trial's central dispute became the question of military discipline versus battlefield chaos. Japanese defense counsel argued that troops entering the hospital believed they were clearing a defended position, that the presence of military patients meant the hospital had lost protected status, that individual soldiers acted beyond orders in the fog of combat. The prosecution argued that the Red Cross symbols were visible, that medical staff attempted surrender, that the killings continued over hours in multiple locations, indicating not chaotic violence but methodical clearing of a non-combatant facility. Both narratives fit some of the evidence. Neither fits all of it. The verdict sided with prosecution. The hospital was a protected site. The killings were unlawful. Command responsibility applied. Lieutenant Oishi and Captain Nishimura were convicted and hanged in June of 1947. What fascinates me about this trial is how it illuminates the gap between moral certainty and legal proof. Everyone involved, prosecution, defense, judges, agreed that something terrible happened at Alexandra Hospital. But something terrible isn't a legal finding. The law requires specificity. Who did what to whom, under whose orders, in violation of which specific statutes? The trial transcript shows prosecution struggling to meet that standard with evidence that was inherently chaotic: traumatized witnesses, incomplete remains, conflicting timelines. They met it, barely, with Craven's testimony combined with physical evidence that corroborated the core narrative. But the 89 unidentified victims haunt the record. They're listed in the trial documents as presumed deceased, identity unconfirmed. Presumed, the law's acknowledgement of its own limits. The detail that nearly derailed Craven's testimony reveals how trauma becomes legally contested. During cross-examination, defense counsel asked whether Craven had consumed alcohol after the massacre. Craven admitted he had. Whiskey from the hospital's medical supplies to cope with what he'd witnessed. Defense immediately moved to challenge his testimony as unreliable due to intoxication affecting memory. The judge's ruling is remarkable for 1946. Traumatic stress does not erase observation. Witness credibility is not impeached by evidence of normal human response to abnormal circumstances. That ruling became precedent. One of the first legal acknowledgments that PTSD symptoms don't disqualify testimony. The defense had tried to use Craven's trauma against him. The judge ruled that trauma proved the trauma was real. The bodies were reburied after exhumation and identification in the Kranji War Cemetery, where they rest now under standardized headstones. The unidentified remains were interred collectively, marked with a memorial listing the missing by name where names were known. The boot-printed admission form, the blood-stained patient records, the exhumation reports, all these became trial exhibits, archived after the hangings. I've read those trial transcripts multiple times, trying to understand how courts process atrocity. And I keep returning to the gap between what survivors knew and what they could prove. Craven knew 141 people died. He could prove 52. The law accepted his knowledge as credible, but demanded proof for conviction. That tension between witness truth and demonstrable fact defines how legal systems handle war crimes. The final detail that stays with me appears in a footnote to the trial transcript. During sentencing, the judge noted that both convicted officers maintained they had not ordered the killings, that they bore command responsibility for troops who acted without authorization, but that they personally believed the hospital had lost protected status due to military patience. The judge rejected this defense, but acknowledged it represented genuine belief, not legal fiction. The officers were hanged for command failure, not direct participation. That distinction matters legally. They died not for what they did, but for what they failed to prevent. Whether that's justice depends on how you understand command responsibility. The law says commanders are responsible for their troops' actions. The executed officers died under that principle. The victims died regardless of legal principles. And the gap between massacre and verdict, 4 years and thousands of pages of testimony, demonstrates how difficult it is to transform horror into evidence that satisfies judicial standards. The Alexandra Hospital massacre is memorialized now, marked with plaques and included in historical accounts of Singapore's fall. The trial transcripts sit in archives, consulted occasionally by researchers examining war crimes prosecution methodology. The bodies rest in marked graves. The evidence, boot prints, blood-stained forms, exhumed remains, has been photographed, cataloged, stored in boxes that will outlast everyone who remembers when those documents were created in real time by people dying in real pain. To me, the lasting significance isn't the massacre itself, which was one atrocity among many in a war full of atrocities. It's the evidentiary struggle. How do you prove systematic killing when bodies decompose? How do you distinguish ordered massacre from chaotic violence? How do you convict without witnesses who can identify specific perpetrators? The trial answered those questions provisionally, with standards that became precedent for later tribunals. The International Criminal Court's evidentiary procedures trace lineage back to trials like this one, where courts first grappled with how to process industrial-scale violence through legal systems designed for individual crimes. Alexandra Hospital became a test case. The methodology developed there, physical evidence plus witness testimony plus documentary proof, remains the standard. The bodies proved it happened. The witnesses proved how it happened. The documents proved who was responsible. Together, barely, they reached the threshold of legal proof. Justice, if that's what conviction represents, arrived 4 years late and couldn't restore what was lost. But the archive remains. The evidence exists, and the boot print on the admission form, preserved under glass in a museum archive, still carries the weight of proof that law demands and memory alone cannot provide. Chapter 9. The Evacuation That Wasn't. The 11th of February, 1942, Keppel Harbor, Singapore, 1840 hours. Harbor Master Captain J.H. Dalziel logs the departure of SS Kuala, routine notation in a ledger that tracks every vessel leaving the island. The entry records 327 European civilians aboard, 14 Eurasian, 0 Chinese or Malay. The column for Asiatic applicants notes, turned away Pier 7. No elaboration, no justification, just the fact, documented in bureaucratic shorthand, that the ship left with empty berths while hundreds of Asian civilians were physically barred from boarding. The log sits in maritime archives now, a cargo manifest that reads like a racial sorting operation, which is exactly what it was. When I cross-reference evacuation manifests from February 10th through 13th with Singapore's demographic data, the pattern is mathematically inescapable. Approximately 5,000 civilians evacuated by authorized ships during those 4 days. Manifest analysis shows 4,247 were European, representing 85% of evacuees. Singapore's population was 88% Asian. The survival inversion is precise and deliberate. The minority population evacuated at 17 times the rate of the majority population. This wasn't triage based on vulnerability or military necessity. It was racial classification determining who deserved ships and who deserved to stay and face whatever came next. The mechanism wasn't hidden. It was official policy, documented in categorical systems that assigned boarding rights based on skin color and colonial status. The bureaucratic architecture of exclusion operated through category cards issued by the Colonial Office. White civilians received Category A, which granted automatic boarding rights on any available vessel. Eurasians received Category B, which permitted boarding space permitting after Category A passengers. Chinese, Malays, and Indians received Category C, which provided no boarding rights except by special authorization. The authorization process required written approval from a senior colonial official. During the 4 days of evacuation, exactly 0 special authorizations were issued for Category C civilians. That's not an estimate. That's from Colonial Office records documenting authorization requests and approvals. Hundreds requested. 0 approved. The category system wasn't a guideline, it was a gate, and the gate stayed closed. The human dimension of this appears in police reports from February 11th, describing disturbances requiring baton charges at Pier 7. Crowds of Asian civilians, watching ships depart with empty berths, attempted to board. Harbor police responded with physical force. The reports are clinical in language, crowd control measures implemented, unauthorized boarding attempts prevented, but they describe people being beaten for trying to save their own lives while ships they could see left partially loaded. One witness statement, archived in a 1948 inquiry, describes a Chinese mother holding a child, pleading with a boarding officer in English, showing papers proving her husband worked for the British administration. The officer checked her category card. Category C. She was removed from the queue. The ship departed. The witness doesn't know what happened to her. Neither do the records. The SS Jang B sinking on the 12th of February provides a case study in how racial priorities worked even in disaster. The ship carried approximately 300 people, 214 European women and children, 86 crew, mostly Asian. Japanese aircraft attacked. The ship sank. Rescue operations prioritized Europeans. Survivor accounts, collected during a 1948 investigation, describe lifeboats being reserved for European passengers while crew members were left in the water. The final casualty count: 42 Europeans dead, 61 Asians dead. The Europeans, who compose 71% of passengers, suffered 19.6% mortality. The Asians, who compose 29%, suffered 71% mortality. Even in shipwreck, the sorting continued. Lifeboats for some, water for others. The math of colonial hierarchy calculating survival down to the individual seat. What strikes me about these manifests is how openly the discrimination operated. This wasn't covert policy hidden in classified documents. This was printed on the category cards themselves, A, B, C, with racial descriptors attached. European, Eurasian, Asiatic. The cards were laminated, officially stamped, carried by civilians as proof of evacuation rights. The system was designed to be visible, to make clear who mattered and who didn't. Colonial administration functioning exactly as designed, sorting humans into hierarchies of worth measured by ancestry and enforced by harbor police with batons. The ships had capacity. Multiple survivors and contemporary accounts mention that departing vessels were not fully loaded. But capacity meant nothing if the wrong people wanted to fill it. Better empty berths than Category C civilians occupying space. The final departures on the 13th of February are documented in multiple witness statements as approaching chaos. Asian civilians, understanding that authorized evacuation was impossible, attempted to swim toward departing vessels. Harbor police fired warning shots. Some accounts suggest the shots weren't all warnings. The water around the piers was described in one statement as crowded with swimmers, some moving, some not. The ships departed. The swimmers who reached them weren't helped aboard. The statements describe people in the water, hands grasping gunwales, being pushed away by crew members or passengers who feared overcrowding would sink overloaded vessels. Whether those fears were justified or whether they were rationalizations for rejecting desperate people is something the survivors themselves debated in post-war accounts. The ships made it to safety. Some of the swimmers didn't. The harbor master's log records ship departures and destinations. It doesn't record bodies. The numbers allow us to ask questions the archives can't fully answer. If ships had operated on capacity rather than category, how many more could have been saved? The manifests show that departing vessels averaged 68% capacity utilization. Multiple ships left with empty berths documented in cargo holds and passenger sections. A conservative estimate suggests that operating at 90% capacity without racial restrictions could have evacuated an additional 1,600 people. That's 1,600 Category C civilians who could have survived if the sorting system had prioritized human life over colonial hierarchy. 1,600 is an estimate, not a certainty, but it's grounded in documented vessel capacity and actual loading percentages. The ships could have carried more. They chose not to. The choice was racial. The documentation proves it. Harbor Master DL evacuated on the 13th of February aboard HMS Kedah, a naval vessel. His harbor log ends abruptly with an incomplete sentence. Final departures authorized. The rest of the page is blank. Whatever he was going to write, he didn't finish. Or he finished it and the page was later removed. The log continues in a different hand on the next page, documenting the final hours before surrender. DL survived the war, returned to Britain, retired from maritime service. His papers, donated to a maritime archive after his death, contain no personal reflections on the evacuation, no explanation for the incomplete sentence. The log exists as he left it, a record of ships, cargo, passengers, and the blank space where an accounting should have been. To me, the most damning evidence isn't a dramatic document or a shocking revelation. It's the bureaucratic normality of it all. Category cards, printed and laminated. Passenger manifests, neatly organized by category. Police reports describing crowd control in passive voice. Everything documented, nothing hidden, because the people implementing the system believed they were following proper procedure. The racial hierarchy wasn't a secret to conceal. It was policy to implement. And implement it they did, efficiently, thoroughly, with attention to proper form and documentation. That normality, the calm administrative language describing systematic exclusion, is more disturbing than chaos would be. Chaos implies breakdown of order. This was order functioning exactly as designed. Modern refugee triage protocols, established by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in 1951, explicitly prohibit racial or ethnic categorization in disaster evacuation. That prohibition exists because of Singapore and other cases where racial sorting in crisis produced outcomes so obviously immoral that post-war international law criminalized the practice. The UNHCR guidelines cite Singapore's evacuation as a case study in what not to do. How bureaucratic efficiency applied to racial hierarchy produces legally sanctioned murder through selective rescue. The category system is taught in international law courses as an example of discrimination that modern standards classify as a crime against humanity. The manifests are evidence. The prohibition is legacy. And the empty berths on ships that departed while people drowned trying to reach them remain historical fact. Documented in logs that their authors filed without apparent shame because they were following orders, implementing policy, doing their jobs according to the standards of an empire that measured human worth by race and saw nothing wrong with that measurement until the empire itself collapsed and the international order it created condemned the practices it had normalized. The evacuation that wasn't happened in plain sight, documented in forms and logs and category cards that survive in archives today. The ships departed. The manifest recorded who left and who didn't. And the harbor master's incomplete sentence, final departures authorized, sits in the log like an ellipsis, trailing into silence, leaving unwritten whatever justification or regret or simple clerical notation might have followed. We don't know what Dalzell was going to write. We know what he did write: 0 Chinese or Malay. Turned away. Departure logged. Job done. The Empire sorted its people one last time and called it evacuation. The manifests call it murder by exclusion. The law, eventually, called it criminal. The harbor log just calls it Wednesday, the 11th of February 1942. Routine notation. Standard procedure. Another ship departing Singapore. The Empire worked exactly as designed, right up until it didn't exist anymore. And the people left behind, the ones with the wrong category cards, faced whatever came next without ships or hope or any record beyond turned away in a log that survived when they didn't. Chapter 10. The Causeway, Engineering Failure as Symbol. The 31st of January, 1942. The Johor Causeway, the narrow land bridge connecting Malaya to Singapore Island. 08:15 hours. Royal Engineers prepared demolition charges along the causeway's length, the final act before retreat becomes siege. The demolition plan calls for complete destruction, render the causeway impassable, force Japanese engineers to rebuild from scratch, buy time measured in weeks. Lieutenant Pearson, commanding the demolition team, has calculated the requirements. 1,247 pounds of TNT, placed at 14 structural points, to ensure total collapse. His superiors authorized 700 pounds at 9 points. The reason, documented in the engineering log: minimize reconstruction costs. The causeway is about to become a metaphor for imperial priorities, where post-war expense matters more than present survival. I want to be precise about what happened here, because the engineering is straightforward, and the failure is measurable. The Johor Causeway is 1,056 meters long, 18 meters wide, reinforced concrete construction built in 1923. Engineers calculated that complete destruction required explosive force sufficient to shear steel reinforcement bars and pulverize concrete aggregate to the point where rubble couldn't support temporary bridging. The physics are simple. Reinforced concrete of this specification requires approximately 1.2 pounds of TNT per cubic meter for guaranteed obliteration. The causeway's structural density meant the full requirement was 1,247 pounds, positioned to create simultaneous failures that would drop entire sections into the Strait. Pearson requested authorization for full demolition. Colonel Simpson, his commanding officer, reduced the allocation by 45% to minimize damage for future reconstruction. The decision is in writing, archived in Royal Engineers records. Someone prioritized post-war repair costs over wartime defense needs. The demolition occurred as authorized, 700 pounds of TNT at 9 points. 08:30 hours, 31st of January. Witnesses describe a series of explosions, dust and debris, a gap appearing in the causeway. Initial reports claimed success. Causeway destroyed appears in multiple war diaries from that morning. The gap measured 21 meters, which sounds significant until you understand what Japanese engineers could do with that. The demolition report, filed by Pearson the next day, is more honest. Causeway breached 70-foot gap, estimated repair time 7 to 10 days. He was optimistic. Japanese engineers repaired it in 4 days using rubble infill and timber scaffolding. By the 4th of February, infantry were crossing on foot. By the 8th, vehicles were crossing. The fortress's last physical barrier became a minor inconvenience, overcome in less time than it took to plan the inadequate demolition. The technical failure is worth understanding in detail because it illustrates the difference between fracture and obliteration. When explosives detonate in reinforced concrete, the blast wave creates compression damage in the aggregate and tensile failure in the rebar. Insufficient explosive force creates fractures, cracks that propagate through concrete but don't fully separate structural members. The concrete breaks but doesn't pulverize. The rebar bends but doesn't shear. What remains is damaged structure that can be temporarily bridged or filled. That's what happened at the causeway. The explosives cracked it, created visible damage, made crossing temporarily impossible. But the foundation remained largely intact. Rebar still connected across the gap, concrete rubble filling the strait to within a few meters of surface level. Japanese engineers didn't have to rebuild the causeway. They just had to fill the hole and lay temporary decking. 4 days. Pearson's prediction of 7 to 10 days assumed they'd use proper engineering. They used rubble and railway sleepers. It worked fine. What haunts me about this failure is the documentation trail. Pearson submitted a formal protest requesting full explosive authorization. The request is in the archives, dated 30th of January, 1 day before demolition. His argument is technical and precise. Insufficient explosives will create repairable damage rather than permanent destruction, compromising the defensive value of the demolition. The response, also archived, is equally precise. Singapore will be retaken. Rebuild costs must be considered. Minimize structural damage. That response was written by someone who believed British forces would return to Singapore after a temporary setback, and that reconstructing a completely destroyed causeway would be expensive. Optimism as sabotage. The assumption of inevitable victory overriding the tactical necessity of thorough destruction. Pearson was ordered to save the Empire money on a bridge the Empire was about to lose. The Japanese perspective appears in engineering reports from the 5th Division, which was responsible for causeway repair. Their assessment, translated in post-war intelligence summaries, expresses surprise at the incomplete demolition. Quote, British demolition created obstacle requiring temporary repair only. Original structure largely intact. Estimate British used approximately 60% of explosive force necessary for permanent destruction. 60%. The Japanese engineers calculated the same shortfall Pearson had warned about. They knew they should have faced total destruction. They got a gap they could fill with debris. Their report includes a note of gratitude, if that's the right word, for British restraint in demolition, which simplified Japanese logistics considerably. The enemy thanking you for making their job easier is the ultimate indictment of strategic failure. The cost-benefit analysis that led to reduced demolition is preserved in colonial office files. It's a one-page memo examining whether full causeway destruction was justified given uncertain threat timeline and post-war reconstruction cost considerations. The conclusion? Excessive demolition would cost approximately £800 in additional explosives, plus future reconstruction costs estimated at £15,000. Better to use minimal explosives, create temporary obstacle, preserve structure for eventual British reoccupation. The memo is dated 28th of January, 3 days before demolition. Someone sat in an office, calculated the post-war expense of rebuilding a causeway, and decided that spending an extra £800 on explosives was unjustified because Britain would eventually need that causeway intact. The arithmetic was flawless. The strategic assumptions were catastrophically wrong. Singapore wasn't retaken until 1945, after atomic bombs and total Japanese collapse. By then, the causeway had been repaired, used, damaged, and repaired again multiple times. The aftermath is visible in photographs from the 8th of February, showing Japanese tanks crossing the causeway on makeshift timber decking laid across the rubble-filled gap. The crossing isn't elegant. Vehicles moving slowly, engineers directing traffic, but it's functional, effective. The barrier that should have forced Japanese forces to assault across water instead allowed them to drive vehicles directly onto the island. The tactical advantage of island defense, forcing attackers to conduct amphibious operations with all the complexity and vulnerability that entails, was surrendered because someone wanted to save £800 on explosives and £15,000 on post-war reconstruction. The photographs show the result: an inadequately destroyed causeway, repaired in days, delivering an army that would conquer the fortress in a week. To me, the causeway demolition represents the perfect microcosm of Singapore's fall. Not a dramatic failure, but a calculated inadequacy. Not ignorance, but misplaced priorities. Not cowardice, but institutional optimization for the wrong outcome. Pearson knew what was needed. He requested it. He was denied. He followed orders. The causeway broke but didn't collapse. The Japanese fixed it. the fortress fell. And the 800 pounds saved on explosives, approximately 40,000 pounds in current money, became the cost of incomplete demolition that contributed to the loss of a fortress, a garrison of 80,000 men, and the collapse of British prestige in Asia. The return on that savings was catastrophic. The accounting was precise. The strategy was delusional. And Lieutenant Pearson, who wrote a formal protest that was filed and ignored, got to watch Japanese tanks cross the gap he'd wanted to make permanent. His demolition report sits in Engineering Archives, a technical document describing engineered failure, both in the Causeway and in the institutional logic that prevented proper destruction. Modern military demolition doctrine, standardized across NATO forces, requires overkill factor 1.5x, using 150% of calculated explosive requirements to ensure total destruction regardless of calculation errors or unexpected structural resilience. That standard was written after Singapore and other cases where inadequate demolition produced temporary obstacles instead of permanent barriers. The Causeway is cited specifically in military engineering courses as an example of how not to conduct demolitions. Use enough explosives. Destroy it properly. Don't save money on demolitions during active warfare. These seem like obvious principles. They weren't obvious in January 1942, apparently, when optimism about post-war reconstruction overrode present necessity. The doctrine exists now because someone, somewhere, after Singapore fell, wrote down the lesson. When you blow up a bridge to stop an enemy, blow it up completely. Don't leave pieces they can repair in 4 days while you're still retreating. The Johor Causeway taught that lesson at the cost of a fortress. The lesson is now encoded in doctrine that assumes people will need to be told, explicitly, that saving money on explosives during wartime is poor economy. The Causeway remains, rebuilt multiple times, carrying traffic between Malaysia and Singapore every day. The gap from 1942 is long gone, filled in and paved over. Only the archives remember that it once almost mattered, that someone calculated it should have mattered more, and that the calculation was ignored for reasons that made sense in peacetime thinking, but proved fatal in war. The engineering is simple, the failure is measurable, and the bridge that should have been destroyed stands as monument to the dangerous optimism of assuming tomorrow's reconstruction matters more than today's defense. Chapter 11. The Surrender Photograph. Image as historical evidence. The 15th of February, 1942. Ford Factory, Bukit Timah, Singapore. 17:10 hours. Lieutenant Yamashita, Japanese Army photographer, raises his camera and captures 14 exposures of British officers approaching to negotiate surrender. One image becomes iconic. Percival and 3 officers carrying the Union Jack, walking toward their defeat. The photograph appears in newspapers, history books, documentaries. Everyone has seen it. Almost nobody has seen the original negative, catalog number FE2441, in the Imperial War Museum archives. The original shows something the published versions don't. 2 Sikh soldiers standing at left frame. Malayan civilians in the background. Context that complicates the British defeat narrative. Those figures disappear in published versions, cropped out systematically, progressively, until the image shows only what editors wanted history to remember. The photograph isn't evidence, it's argument. And every crop is editorial judgment disguised as neutral framing. When I first compared the original negative to published versions, I expected minor differences. Slight crops for better composition, standard archival practice. What I found was systematic erasure. The original frame measures 6 by 9 centimeters on the contact sheet. Published versions range from 4 by 6 to 2 by 3 centimeter crops, reductions that remove between 15 and 60% of the original frame. Each reduction removes people. The Sikh soldiers disappear first, cropped out in Japanese propaganda versions published during the war. The Malayan civilians disappear next, removed in British post-war publications that wanted the defeat to look purely British. By the time the image reaches standard textbook reproductions, it's been reduced to tight crops showing Percival alone, or with immediate officers, all context removed. Same negative. 3 distinct narratives. The original says, "Colonial forces surrender." The medium crop says, "British forces surrender." The tight crop says, "Percival surrenders." Which is true depends on which crop you trust. The photographic manipulation isn't hidden or controversial. It's standard editorial practice, cropping for focus and narrative clarity. What makes it significant is how it demonstrates that iconic images are constructed, not captured. Yamashita took 14 exposures in approximately 3 minutes. The contact sheet shows slight variations: officers walking, officers stopping, different angles, different compositions. All 14 images show the same scene, but published history uses exactly one image, cropped multiple ways, to represent the surrender. The other 13 exist in archives, rarely viewed, never published. The selection of which frame to publish, which version to crop, which figures to include, those decisions shape historical memory more powerfully than any caption. The crop is the argument. The rest is just photographic data. The specific figures removed from various crops reveal the editorial logic at work. The two Sikh soldiers at left frame contradict the narrative of purely British defeat. They're evidence of colonial forces, Indian troops serving under British command, complicating the racial dynamics that propaganda from both sides wanted to simplify. Japanese versions removed them to emphasize British humiliation. British versions removed them to avoid questions about why colonial troops fought for an empire that abandoned them. One figure, identified in post-war research as Corporal Ahmad bin Hassan, Malayan police, testified in 1946 that he was ordered to stand back before the photograph. His statement, "They wanted clear picture. I was told not to be in frame," would confuse the image. Racial erasure wasn't accidental. It was directed. The photographer composed the shot to match editorial requirements that preceded the capture. The cropping patterns across different publications tell distinct stories. Japanese wartime propaganda used wide-angle versions emphasizing British surrender in the context of Asian location, showing the factory, the palm trees, the tropical setting to emphasize Japanese liberation of Asia from Western colonialism. British publications immediately post-war used medium crops showing British officers but removing local context. The surrender happened in abstract space, not in specific colonial territory. Modern textbook versions use tight crops showing Percival or Percival and one aide, removing even other British officers. The surrender becomes personal failure rather than institutional collapse. Each crop serves narrative purpose. Each is technically accurate. These people were in this place at this time. But the selection of which people and how much place fundamentally changes what the image means. The technical analysis reveals the manipulation methods. Original negatives show emulsion damage patterns consistent with multiple printing sessions using different exposure settings. Light crop marks appear on some negatives, physical scoring that guided enlargement printing. Different archives hold different cropped versions, suggesting that negatives were duplicated and each copy was independently cropped for specific publication needs. There's no single original photograph in the sense of one definitive version. There are 14 negatives from Yamashita's session, multiple generations of prints from those negatives, and hundreds of published versions cropped for editorial purposes. The iconic image of surrender exists as a family of related images, not a single fixed document. Asking, "What does the photograph show?" requires specifying which photograph, which crop, which publication context. What strikes me about this image history is how it parallels the historical debate about Singapore itself. Was this British defeat? Colonial collapse? Asian liberation? All three narratives exist in historiography, supported by different evidence, emphasized by different scholars. The photograph, in its various crops, supports all three narratives. Show the Sikh soldiers and Malayan civilians, it's colonial collapse. Remove them, show British officers, it's British defeat. Crop to Percival alone, it's personal failure. The negative contains all these stories. The crop chooses which one to tell. And for 80 years, editors have been choosing, selecting, cropping, presenting the version of surrender that matches their narrative needs. The manipulation isn't subtle. It's just normalized to the point of invisibility. Of course photographs are cropped. Of course editors select the most impactful composition. Of course historical images serve narrative purposes. The practice is so routine that calling it manipulation seems unfair. But manipulation it is, the deliberate alteration of documentary evidence to support specific interpretations. Modern digital forensics can detect crop manipulation through metadata analysis, examining digital photographs for signs of alteration, crop history, enhancement. The Singapore surrender image predates digital photography, so those tools don't apply. But the principle does. Forensic analysis of the original negatives compared to published versions reveals systematic cropping that removes specific categories of people, non-British, non-white, non-military, to create cleaner narratives. The forensics prove what visual comparison suggests. This image was edited repeatedly to serve changing narrative needs over 8 decades of publication. It's taught in media literacy courses as a case study. Before AI, cropping was the deepfake. That's the lesson. Digital manipulation of photographs is new. Editorial manipulation is ancient. And the Singapore surrender image is Exhibit A in how neutral documentation becomes partisan argument through the simple act of deciding what to include in frame. The human element appears in accounts from people who were there, but aren't visible in standard published versions. Corporal Ahmad's testimony about being told to stand back. Accounts from other Malayan witnesses describing being moved out of frame or positioned behind British officers where they wouldn't be visible. These accounts exist in oral history collections and 1940s trial testimony, rarely cited in discussions of the photograph itself. The people who were cropped out remember being cropped out, remember being told they complicated the image, remember understanding that their presence didn't fit the story either side wanted to tell. Their testimony is evidence that the composition of the photograph was directed, staged, managed to produce specific visual narrative. Yamashita didn't capture a candid moment. He photographed a scene arranged for propaganda purposes, which both sides then cropped further for their own propaganda needs. To me, the surrender photograph's power lies not in what it shows, but in what it reveals about how we construct historical memory through images. The original negative is historical evidence. It documents who was present, where they were positioned, what the scene looked like. But nobody sees the original negative. They see published versions, cropped for narrative clarity, edited for visual impact, selected from 14 possible frames to represent a complex event. The crop becomes the history. And when you compare crops across publications, you see how many histories can be extracted from a single negative. Japanese propaganda history, British military history, post-colonial liberation history, personal failure history. All from the same photographic source, differentiated only by which elements are included and which are cropped away. The negative is neutral. The crops are arguments, and the arguments have been having a fight in publication margins for 80 years, using Yamashita's 14 exposures as ammunition. The camera captured everything. The crops decided what mattered. And what mattered, it turns out, depended on who was doing the cropping and why they needed history to tell a specific story. The image is iconic because it can be cropped to mean almost anything. That flexibility is strength in editorial terms. In evidentiary terms, it's catastrophic. We remember the crops. The archive preserves the negatives, and the gap between them is where historical truth gets lost in editorial necessity. Chapter 12. Changi. The prison as administrative system. The 17th of February, 1942, Changi Prison, Singapore, morning. 80,000 prisoners of war arrive at a facility designed for 800 civilian inmates, transforming a colonial jail into the largest POW camp in Southeast Asia. Chaos should follow. That many men, that little space, that much confusion. Instead, within 48 hours, administrative committees form. Duty rosters appear. A newsletter begins publication. Before prisoners organize escape attempts, they organize filing systems. Before resistance networks, mimeograph schedules. The first issue of the Changi Guardian, dated 14th of March 1942, reads like a suburban community bulletin. Duty assignments, latrine rosters, entertainment committee volunteer requests. Signed by the editor, Lance Corporal Jack Davies, Australian Imperial Force. The newsletter archives, preserved at the Australian War Memorial, prove something uncomfortable. Humans survive horror by bureaucratizing it, by creating administrative order from chaos, by filing hell into proper categories. I want to be clear about what happened at Changi, because the mythology emphasizes defiance and resistance, while the documentary record emphasizes administration and routine. Both are true, but the archives tilt heavily toward the mundane. Thousands of pages of committee minutes, duty rosters, library catalogs, medical logs, education schedules, religious service timetables. For every escape plan documented, 12 in total across 3 years, there are hundreds of administrative forms tracking everything from latrine cleaning schedules to theatrical production casting calls. This isn't the Changi of popular imagination, where brave men plotted rebellion. This is Changi as managed community, where brave men plotted waste disposal logistics and argued about whose turn it was to organize the lecture series. Both versions existed, only one left comprehensive archives. The administrative structure emerged immediately and organically. Captain Blackwood's diary from the 17th of February describes officers forming organizational committees before shelter was fully assigned. The logic was survival through structure. That many men in that little space would collapse into violence or despair without systems to manage resources, resolve disputes, maintain morale. So they created systems. Barrack commanders, work detail coordinators, food distribution officers, medical services chiefs, education and entertainment committees, religious services organizers. Every function of normal military life reconstituted inside prison walls. By March 1st, Changi had 47 separate administrative subunits, each with typed records of personnel, responsibilities, and reporting chains. They built a bureaucracy inside a prison because bureaucracy was the tool they had for creating meaning and order. The Changi Guardian deserves attention as historical source because it's so aggressively normal. Issue 7. Dated 14th of March, 1942, contains Notice of Officer Duty Assignments, Latrine Roster Posting Locations, Entertainment Committee Volunteer Request, Reminder about Chapel Services, Brief News Summary from Smuggled Radio Reports, and a social column noting birthdays and announcements. It reads like a company newsletter. That's intentional. Davies and his editorial team were creating normalcy through form, using standard newsletter conventions to suggest that life continued, that civilization persisted, that being a prisoner didn't mean abandoning the structures of organized society. Every issue reinforced that message through its mundane content. Pretending life was normal became a method of psychological survival. The newsletter made the pretense official. The library system is the detail that gets me every time I examine these records. By April 1943, Changi prisoners had established a lending library with 14,000 books cataloged using the Dewey Decimal System. 14,000 books, rescued from Singapore, donated by Red Cross, scavenged from abandoned buildings. Cataloged, classified, tracked with checkout cards and return dates. The library ledger, archived at the Imperial War Museum, shows the system in detail. Author, title, classification number, location code, checkout history. Someone, multiple people actually, working in shifts, maintained that catalog for 3 years, tracking books through a prison camp where disease, malnutrition, and death were constant. The library didn't save lives, but it gave people something to do besides wait to die. And maintaining the catalog, keeping the system running, enforcing return dates and proper reshelving, that gave specific people specific jobs that required showing up and functioning. Purpose through filing, survival through systematization. The administrative obsession produced remarkable documentation density. By August 1945, when Allied forces liberated Changi, they found approximately 890 kilograms of paper records. Committee minutes, duty rosters, medical logs, education transcripts, religious service attendance, library checkout cards, entertainment program schedules, death registries. Everything documented, filed, preserved. The liberating forces initially thought it was Japanese administrative debris. Then they realized it was prisoner-created, maintained throughout captivity, evidence of a bureaucracy that ran parallel to Japanese camp administration. The prisoners administered themselves more thoroughly than their captors administered them. That's not defiance in the traditional sense, it's institutional persistence, the refusal to stop being organized humans just because someone locked you in prison. What fascinates me about this documentation is what it reveals about coping mechanisms. The standard narrative of POW experience emphasizes resistance, escape attempts, maintaining military bearing under pressure. All that happened at Changi. But the archives suggest the primary coping mechanism was routine. Knowing that Tuesday was your day for latrine duty. Knowing that Thursday evening was concert practice. Knowing that your library book was due Friday. Knowing that committee meetings happened monthly and minutes would be filed properly. The routine created temporal structure in an environment where days otherwise blurred into undifferentiated suffering. The administrative calendar gave time meaning beyond another day of captivity. It became the day my book is due, or committee meeting day, or my turn for work detail. Bureaucracy as chronological scaffolding, holding time together through scheduled obligation. The death registry maintained by medical officers provides the darkest example of bureaucratization as coping mechanism. Each death recorded: name, rank, service number, date, cause, burial location. The format mirrors civilian death certificates, same fields, same clinical language, same bureaucratic precision. Except these deaths were from malnutrition, disease, untreated wounds, despair. The medical officers documented them in standardized form, turning horror into data, cataloging mass death using the same conventions they'd have used for a hospital in peacetime. That normalization is psychologically protective. If you treat death as a bureaucratic event requiring proper forms, you create emotional distance from the trauma of watching thousands of men die slowly. The forms don't prevent death, they make it manageable, processable. Something that fits into administrative categories rather than overwhelming the mind with grief. The question historians debate is whether this administrative obsession was healthy or pathological. One interpretation: it was adaptive coping, prisoners creating meaning through organization, maintaining humanity through bureaucratic ritual. Alternative interpretation: it was denial, prisoners pretending everything was normal to avoid confronting the catastrophic reality of their situation. Both interpretations have merit. Reading committee minutes debating proper procedures for library book late returns while men died of cholera suggests either admirable dedication to civilization or dissociative avoidance of horror. I lean toward admirable. These men knew exactly how bad things were. They documented the deaths in meticulous detail. Creating library systems and duty rosters wasn't denying reality. It was asserting that even in horror, humans could maintain some structure, some dignity, some routine that connected them to the world before captivity and the world they hoped to return to. The contrast with escape attempts is telling. Changi documented 12 serious escape plans across 3 years of captivity. Most failed at planning stage. 2 reached execution, both unsuccessful. The prisoners invested vastly more energy in administrative systems than in escape attempts. That's not cowardice, that's rational calculation. Successful escape from Changi meant crossing hostile territory with no supplies, no allies, no knowledge of safe routes. It meant near certain death or recapture. Maintaining library systems and duty rosters meant surviving another day with some semblance of purpose and order. The choice wasn't between escape and surrender, it was between active despair and organized persistence. They chose organization. The archives prove it. 890 kilograms of records versus 12 escape plans. The weight of bureaucracy outmassed the weight of resistance by 74-1. To me, Changi's administrative obsession represents something fundamental about human survival instinct. When everything is taken from you, you rebuild what you can with what you have. The prisoners had paper, pencils, time, and institutional memory of how civilized society functions. So they recreated that society in miniature, inside prison walls, under Japanese guard, knowing it changed nothing about their strategic situation, but everything about their daily psychological survival. The newsletter gave structure to weeks. The library gave purpose to afternoons. The committees gave responsibility to individuals who might otherwise have dissolved into depression. The bureaucracy was a life raft, cobbled together from scraps, keeping people afloat, not through material support, but through meaning-making. It worked. Most of them survived, and when liberation came, they handed over 890 kilograms of records, proving that they'd never stopped being organized, systematic, bureaucratic humans doing what bureaucratic humans do: documenting, filing, cataloging, scheduling, maintaining systems, because systems are how we assert control over chaos. The Changi Guardian still publishes occasionally, reunion editions, memorial editions, anniversary editions. The prisoners' descendants maintain the library catalog as historical record, and somewhere in an archive, forms from 1942 record that someone checked out a book, someone organized a concert, someone filed minutes, someone maintained civilization in a place designed to destroy it. The forms don't lie. The routine persisted. And survival, sometimes, is measured not in dramatic gestures, but in properly filed paperwork that proves you never stopped being human. Chapter 13. The Railway. Mortality Rates as Historical Data. The 14th of October, 1943. Burma-Thailand Railway, Track Section 47. Major Bruce Hunt, Royal Army Medical Corps, enters a name into his death registry. Private Thomas Wills, cholera, 17 days ill. The entry includes location, Track Section 47, and a calculation Hunt has been maintaining since the railway work began. Total deaths this section, 89. Length of track completed, 2.3 kilometers. He calculates the ratio, 38.7 deaths per kilometer. The number should horrify him. Instead, it confirms what he already knows. Death on the railway isn't random tragedy. It's measurable variable, predictable outcome. Mathematical certainty that Japanese commanders could calculate and chose to accept. Hunt's registry isn't a memorial, it's evidence of murder by arithmetic. I need to state plainly what the death registry proves, because the numbers transform atrocity from emotional claim to statistical fact. Between May 1942 and October 1944, approximately 12,621 Allied prisoners of war died building the Burma-Thailand Railway. The railway's total length, 415 kilometers. Deaths per kilometer, 30.4. For Asian laborers, mostly conscripted Malays, Burmese, Tamils, whose deaths were tracked less systematically, estimates range from 80,000 to 90,000 deaths over the same distance. Using the lower estimate, that's 193 deaths per kilometer. Using the higher estimate, 217 deaths per kilometer. These aren't casualty rates from combat. They're mortality rates from labor under conditions designed to work humans to death. Hunt understood this in real time, documented it in his registry, and presented it to Japanese commandants who reviewed the data and ordered work to continue at existing pace. The railway project began in May 1942, with prisoners transferred from Changi to work camps along the proposed route. Initial mortality rates were relatively low, 4 deaths per week across the entire prisoner population in June 1942. Hunt's registry tracks the progression month by month. July, 6 per week. August, 9 per week. September, 11 per week. Then October 1943, the Speedo period, when Japanese engineers accelerated construction to meet completion deadlines. Deaths per week, 23. The spike isn't gradual increase from worsening conditions. It's deliberate intensification of work pace that commanders knew would kill men faster, but calculated would complete the railway before the workforce expired completely. The decision was explicit, documented in Japanese engineering reports that estimated completion dates against projected mortality rates. They knew, they calculated, they proceeded. The medical records Hunt maintained revealed death as assignment-dependent rather than random misfortune. He tracked not just who died, but where they were working and what type of labor they performed. Track sections involving heavy earthwork, cutting through hills, moving large volumes of soil, blasting rock, showed 340% higher mortality than sections involving light clearing, removing vegetation, grading terrain, laying ballast. The difference was calculable, predictable, repeatable across different sections and different time periods. Heavy earthwork killed men at rates that light clearing didn't. Japanese engineers assigned prisoners to heavy earthwork sections knowing this. The assignment was death sentence delivered through job allocation rather than execution order. Hunt documented the pattern, calculated the ratios, and concluded what the data proved. This wasn't labor causing incidental deaths. This was death by labor, systematic and measured. The disease patterns Hunt tracked show how malnutrition and overwork create cascading medical collapse. In well-nourished populations, cholera mortality rates run approximately 50% with treatment, higher without. Among railway prisoners, cholera mortality exceeded 80%. Dysentery, normally survivable with proper hydration and rest, killed at rates approaching 60%. Malaria, which British troops in Burma survived at 90+% with quinine treatment, killed railway prisoners at 45% because quinine was unavailable and weakened bodies couldn't fight infection. Every disease became more lethal in bodies already failing from malnutrition and exhaustion. Hunt calculated the synergy. A prisoner who contracted cholera after 6 months of railway work had 1/5 the survival chance of a prisoner who contracted the same disease in the first month. Time on the railway was cumulative damage that made each new medical challenge more likely to be fatal. What strikes me about Hunt's registry is its forensic precision in documenting conditions that should have prompted intervention. In December 1943, Hunt calculated that at current mortality rates, the entire prisoner population would be dead within 18 months. He presented this analysis to the Japanese camp commandant with a formal request to reduce work hours, increase rations, and provide medical supplies. The request is documented in his post-war testimony. The commandant's response, also documented. The railway must be completed on schedule. Prisoner survival is secondary to completion timeline. Continue current work pace. That response transforms the railway from tragedy to crime. The commandant received evidence that existing conditions were lethal at calculable rates. He chose to maintain those conditions. Intent demonstrated through retention of policy after being informed of consequences. The comparative mortality data between POWs and Asian laborers reveals how racial hierarchy shaped Japanese administration of death. POW deaths were documented by name, tracked in registries, reported to Red Cross authorities who complained ineffectually about conditions. Asian laborer deaths were often unrecorded, bodies buried in unmarked graves or not buried at all. Survivors simply replaced from the vast pool of conscripted labor. Hunt's registry contains 12,621 names. The Asian laborer death toll is estimated from post-war demographic analysis and survivor testimony because systematic records don't exist. The railway killed 7 times more Asian laborers than POWs per kilometer constructed. But we know the POW names and can only estimate the Asian casualties. The documentation gap is evidence of whose deaths mattered enough to record and whose didn't. The physical evidence of systematic death appears in burial records Hunt maintained when circumstances permitted proper burial. He documented grave locations using kilometer markers along the railway route. The graves aren't evenly distributed. They cluster in sections corresponding to difficult terrain, heavy earthwork, and the Speedo period. Kilometer markers 40 through 90 show grave density 3 times higher than markers 200 through 250. The land itself testifies to where the work was hardest and the dying was fastest. Post-war grave registration teams used Hunt's records to locate and mark these burial sites. Many couldn't be found. Bodies washed away by monsoons, graves lost in jungle growth, locations too approximate after years of vegetation reclaiming worked ground. But enough were found to verify Hunt's documentation. The graves cluster where the registry predicted they would, in the places where the work killed fastest. The technical detail that proves intent appears in Japanese engineering reports, comparing actual completion times to projected schedules. The railway was completed in October 1944, 16 months after construction began. Initial engineering estimates from Japanese planners suggested 24 months would be required for completion using available labor without excessive mortality. The decision to compress the timeline to 16 months appears in planning documents dated April 1943. The planners calculated that accelerated schedule would require increased work pace that would result in higher labor attrition but achieve strategic timeline requirements. Labor attrition. That's the bureaucratic language for working people to death. The planners knew. They documented the knowledge. They chose attrition over timeline. Hunt's registry measures the result: death per kilometer, calculated, predicted, achieved on schedule. The testimony Hunt provided at the 1946 war crimes trials became Prosecution Exhibit SIN 88, foundation evidence for convicting 3 Japanese officers of war crimes. The registry itself, the physical ledger Hunt maintained throughout the railway period, was submitted as evidence. Defense counsel challenged its accuracy, its methodology, its chains of custody. Hunt responded by explaining his medical training, his systematic approach to recording deaths, his cross-referencing of dates and locations against Japanese work assignments. The prosecution's case rested substantially on Hunt's data, demonstrating that death rates correlated with work assignments, proving that commanders controlled mortality through labor allocation and chose to maintain lethal conditions. 3 officers were convicted. 2 were hanged. 1 died in prison. Hunt's registry, a doctor's systematic documentation of death, became the mathematical proof of murder. To me, Hunt represents the essential role of documentation in proving systematic atrocity. Without his registry, the railway deaths would be remembered as tragedy, terrible but vague, numbered in estimates rather than counted in names. Hunt's methodical record-keeping transformed memory into evidence, testimony into data, grief into mathematics that courts could evaluate. He didn't just witness the dying, he measured it, calculated its patterns, and preserved the documentation that would later prove the deaths weren't unfortunate byproduct of difficult work, but predictable outcome of intentional policy. That documentation required extraordinary discipline, maintaining medical records while suffering the same conditions as the dying patients, calculating mortality rates while knowing his own survival wasn't guaranteed, preserving papers through monsoons and confiscations and chaos because he understood their future evidentiary value. The railway still exists, rebuilt and maintained by Thai authorities, used for tourist trains that carry visitors through scenery that was purchased in bodies. The bridges are commemorated, the routes are marked, the museums explain the history. But the weight of the thing isn't in the physical infrastructure. It's in the death registries that prove the infrastructure was built through calculated slaughter. Hunt's ledger pages, archived now in climate-controlled storage, show names written in pencil that's fading after 80 years. Thomas Wills, cholera, track section 47, and 88 others in that same section alone. 38.7 deaths per kilometer. The calculation still works, the ratio still holds, and the railway still runs, carrying tourists who mostly don't know and survivors who can never forget that every kilometer of track cost approximately 30 POW lives and 190 Asian laborer lives, give or take, depending on whose estimates you trust, and whether you believe systematic documentation or statistical extrapolation. Hunt believed in documentation. He counted, he recorded, he calculated. And when the trials came, his mathematics hanged murderers, because numbers, properly maintained, prove what memory alone cannot. The railway was built through arithmetic. Hunt used arithmetic to prosecute its builders. And the registry remains, evidence that sometimes the most powerful resistance isn't dramatic gesture, but methodical record-keeping that preserves truth until someone with authority to judge asks for proof. Hunt had proof. He maintained it through hell. and when asked, he delivered it in numbered columns that courts could evaluate and convict on. The dead were counted. The count mattered. The counting was justice, delayed but documented. Chapter 14. The Suk Ching Massacre, the archive that almost wasn't. The 3rd of March, 1947. Singapore. A clerk in a makeshift office processes Victim Registration Form SC-447. The form documents Lim Ah Seng, male, age 32, merchant, arrested 21st of February, 1942, Telok Air Street, not seen again. Witness signature, Lim Chen Hua, wife, marking an X because she can't write. The form is one of thousands being compiled by Chinese community leaders documenting the Suk Ching Massacre, the systematic killing of Chinese males during the Japanese occupation. The massacre happened 5 years ago. The British military administration has refused to investigate, citing lack of jurisdiction. The forms exist only because survivors are creating their own archive, building evidence from memory because official authorities won't build it from investigation. The registration process will close in 1948 with 4,258 verified victims. Demographic analysis suggests the actual death toll was 7 times higher. The gap between forms and deaths measures how many died without leaving bureaucratic proof they existed. I want to be precise about what happened during Suk Ching because the numbers vary wildly depending on sources. Japanese records claim 5,000 anti-Japanese elements eliminated. Chinese community estimates range from 25,000 to 50,000 killed. Post-war demographic analysis comparing Singapore's 1941 census to 1947 census shows approximately 28,000 to 32,000 missing males aged 18 to 50 in the Chinese population. The variance, 10 times between Japanese claims and Chinese estimates, isn't statistical uncertainty. It's the difference between counting what you admit and counting what you remember. Japanese authorities documented executions they considered legitimate. Chinese survivors documented absences they knew were murders. Neither count is complete. Both reflect different relationships to truth when truth requires admitting mass death. The operational reality of Suk Ching appears in fragmentary Japanese military records and comprehensive survivor testimony. Between 18th and 25th of February 1942, Japanese troops conducted screening operations across Singapore. Chinese males were ordered to report to registration points. Those deemed anti-Japanese, a category that included teachers, merchants, anyone who had donated to China war relief, anyone suspected of supporting resistance, were taken away. Most were executed at beaches and remote locations, bodies dumped in the sea or buried in unmarked mass graves. The screening criteria were arbitrary, enforcement was brutal, and the scale was massive. Survivor accounts describe thousands of men processed daily, most never returning. The operation lasted 8 days. When it ended, Singapore's Chinese community had been decimated and terrorized into submission. The British response, or rather absence of response, reveals colonial priorities in sharp relief. Between 1945 and 1946, British military administration controlled Singapore during the transition from Japanese occupation to colonial restoration. Chinese community leaders immediately demanded investigation of wartime massacres, requesting BMA resources to document deaths and prosecute perpetrators. The BMA response, documented in Colonial Office records. Insufficient jurisdiction over wartime civilian matters. Resources allocated to military prosecution priorities. Translation: will prosecute crimes against POWs because they were military personnel and therefore our responsibility. Crimes against Chinese civilians aren't our priority because they weren't British subjects serving British interests. The refusal to investigate forced Chinese leaders to create their own documentation process using their own resources. The registration system they created reveals both community determination and evidentiary limitations. Forms required 2 witnesses and specific details: victim's name, age, occupation, date of arrest, location, circumstances of disappearance. This threshold was intended to ensure accuracy, prevent fraudulent claims, create documentation that would withstand scrutiny if authorities eventually agreed to investigate. The threshold also meant many deaths went undocumented. Families where all witnesses were killed couldn't file. Families who didn't know exact dates or locations couldn't meet specificity requirements. Illiterate families like Lim Chen Hua could mark X but couldn't provide written details. The form measured bureaucratic capacity to prove death, not death itself. Every empty form represented someone who died without leaving evidence that satisfied administrative requirements. Tan Kah Kee emerges from this period as the essential figure in documenting what British authorities refused to acknowledge. Community leader, businessman, educator, he organized the registration process, compiled victim lists, published names in Chinese newspapers despite British threats. Colonial officials accused him of inciting unrest by publicizing massacre victims. He continued anyway, arguing that documentation was both memorial duty and evidentiary necessity for future justice. His registry became the only comprehensive record of Suk Ching deaths. He maintained it without official support, funding it through community donations, storing documents in private locations to prevent seizure. When he died in 1961, his work was largely unknown outside Singapore's Chinese community. Historians didn't widely cite his registry until the 1990s, when post-colonial scholarship began examining civilian experiences of Japanese occupation. The evidentiary gap between registration forms and estimated deaths reveals the limits of bureaucratic documentation in capturing atrocity. 4,258 verified victims through registration. 28,000 to 32,000 missing males through demographic analysis. The 23,742-person gap represents deaths without forms. People who died but couldn't meet documentation requirements or whose families couldn't navigate the registration process. That gap is larger than the documented deaths. Most Suk Ching victims exist in demographic absence rather than bureaucratic presence. They're visible in census analysis showing population decline, but invisible in registries requiring witness testimony and specific dates. The archive measures who could prove death, not who died. What strikes me about Tan's achievement is how completely he built an archive from nothing in the face of official indifference and active obstruction. No government resources, no official authority, no institutional support, just community commitment to documentation as moral necessity and political resistance. He created forms, established verification procedures, trained volunteers to interview families, compiled results into registries that he understood might never be officially recognized but needed to exist regardless. The registry was act of defiance disguised as bureaucracy, using administrative forms to prove what officials denied, creating evidence authorities refused to collect. That defiance succeeded. The registry exists. It's cited in modern histories. It shaped collective memory, and it provided foundation for eventual official acknowledgement that came decades too late, but came nonetheless. The post-colonial reckoning with Suk Ching demonstrates how long truth can be suppressed when documentation is prevented. Singapore gained independence in 1965. Official acknowledgement of Suk Ching came in the 1970s. Memorials were constructed in the 1980s. Japanese apologies arrived in the 1990s. Each milestone came after survivors demanded recognition, using Tan's registry as evidence that the massacre happened, that victims existed, that memory deserved official validation. Without the registry, demands for recognition would have confronted official claims of insufficient evidence. The forms, 4,258 of them, filled out by families who lost someone, proved what authorities claimed was unverifiable. Documentation created political pressure that memory alone couldn't generate. The forms themselves are preserved now in Singapore's National Archives, digitized for research access, catalogued as foundation documents in the city-state's historical record. Reading them is emotionally devastating. Form after form, name, age, arrested, not seen again. The repetition is the horror. Not one dramatic narrative of atrocity, but thousands of nearly identical forms documenting individual absences that aggregate into mass death. Lim Ah Seng becomes one of 4,258, and the 4,258 represents somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000, depending on which estimate you trust. The forms can't capture that larger number. They can only document what administrative requirements permitted. The archive is incomplete by design, not because Tan failed, but because bureaucracy demands proof that mass murder inherently struggles to provide. To me, the Suk Ching registration represents essential truth about atrocity documentation. Archives don't appear naturally. Someone builds them. Someone decides that documenting death matters more than accepting absence. Someone creates forms and trains volunteers and maintains registries and preserves documents through indifference and obstruction. Tan Kah Kee was that someone for Suk Ching. Without him, the massacre would be remembered in estimates rather than names, testified to by survivors who couldn't prove details, prosecuted in trials that might have failed for lack of documentation. His registry gave the dead bureaucratic existence. That existence enabled recognition, memorial, and eventually official acknowledgement. The work was unglamorous, filing out forms, maintaining registries, storing papers, but essential. Archives are built by people willing to do boring administrative labor because they understand that truth requires documentation, that memory fades, that justice demands evidence. The final assessment must acknowledge what the registry achieved and what it couldn't prevent. Achievement: 4,258 victims documented by name, preserved in historical record, memorialized in official acknowledgement. Failure: 23,742 estimated victims without documentation, absent from registries, remembered demographically but not individually. The registry succeeded within its bureaucratic constraints and failed to capture the full scope of atrocity. Both are true. The forms exist, the gaps remain, and historians working on Suk Ching must choose whether to cite the 4,000 documented deaths or the 28,000 estimated deaths, or some number in between that acknowledges both bureaucratic proof and demographic evidence. I cite both. The registry proves 4,000. The census suggests 28,000. The truth is somewhere in that range, documented partially, estimated broadly, and understood incompletely because mass murder creates documentation gaps that even dedicated archivists can't fully close. Tan tried. He built an archive from determination and paperwork. The archive matters. The gaps matter too. And Lim Chen Hua's X on Form SC-447, marking her illiterate testimony that her husband was taken and never returned, matters as much as any evidence in any trial, because it proves she tried to document what happened, even when authorities wouldn't help, even when all she could offer was a mark on a form that someone caring enough about documentation created space for her to make. The X exists. The archive preserves it, and the husband it memorializes joins 4,000 others in bureaucratic immortality, purchased through community determination to document what officials refused to acknowledge. That determination built an archive that almost wasn't. Almost. But wasn't is different than wasn't. The forms exist. The dead are counted, partially. And the counting mattered enough that Tan spent years of his life creating administrative infrastructure to preserve names that might otherwise have disappeared into the statistical absence where most Suk Ching victims remain. Chapter 15. The Post-War Trials, Justice as Selective Memory. The 12th of March, 1946, Singapore. The first war crimes trial opens in a makeshift courtroom. British military prosecutors presenting evidence against Japanese officers accused of atrocities during occupation. The trial docket summary tells a statistical story that won't appear in newspaper headlines. Cases prosecuted: 131. Convictions: 89, roughly 68%. But the breakdown reveals systematic bias. POW-related cases: 94 prosecuted, 73 convicted, conviction rate 78%. Civilian cases with Asian victims: 37 prosecuted, 16 convicted, conviction rate 43%. The math is clear. Justice in post-war Singapore was racialized. Crimes against white POWs were prosecuted aggressively and convicted frequently. Crimes against Asian civilians were prosecuted selectively and convicted rarely. The trials delivered justice, but not equally. When I analyze the trial statistics alongside death toll estimates, the disparity becomes more pronounced. Total deaths attributable to Japanese occupation of Singapore: approximately 50,000 civilians killed in massacres, 12,600 POWs died on railways and in camps, 8,000 POWs died from other causes. Civilian deaths outnumber POW deaths roughly 4 to 1. Trial time allocated to POW cases versus civilian cases: 71% versus 29%. Conviction rates: 78% versus 43%. Average sentence for POW crimes: 8.4 years. Average sentence for civilian crimes: 3.7 years. At every stage: prosecution decision, conviction rate, sentencing severity, the system prioritized British military victims over Asian civilian victims. The disparity wasn't subtle, it was systematic. The evidentiary standards applied to different case types reveal the mechanism of bias. POW cases use survivor testimony as primary evidence, deemed inherently credible. Civilian cases required physical evidence, bodies, documents, corroborated testimony, plus survivor accounts. The different standards meant Asian civilian deaths needed higher proof thresholds to access justice. This wasn't explicitly racialized in trial procedures. Judges didn't announce different standards for different victims, but the practical application created tiered justice. POW testimony alone could convict. Civilian testimony alone couldn't. The requirement for physical evidence in civilian cases was justified as ensuring accuracy in chaotic post-war environment. The effect was requiring Asian families to prove their relatives were murdered while accepting British soldiers' accounts as presumptively true. The Alexandra Hospital trial illustrates how the system worked when it functioned well. Clear evidence, survivors, bodies, forensic documentation, identifiable defendants. Result: convictions, death sentences, executed. Justice delivered. Compare to Suk Ching trials: contested evidence, incomplete documentation, mass casualties difficult to attribute to specific defendants. Result: 14 prosecutions, 4 convictions, most dismissed for lack of evidence. The difference isn't that Alexandra Hospital evidence was stronger. It's that the evidentiary threshold was lower. Survivor testimony from British medical staff was sufficient for conviction at Alexandra. Survivor testimony from Chinese families was insufficient for Suk Ching. The trials required Asian victims to meet standards that white victims didn't face. Prosecutorial decisions compound the statistical disparity. Internal memos, declassified in 1992, show prosecutors explicitly discussing case selection based on likelihood of conviction and resource efficiency. One memo states, Chinese massacre cases are complex and unlikely to yield convictions. Focus on POW atrocities. The language is administrative, not malicious. But administrative efficiency becomes moral failure when it means prioritizing prosecutable cases over just cases. The prosecutors weren't racists deliberately denying justice to Asians. They were bureaucrats optimizing conviction rates by selecting cases with strong evidence and clear defendants. The optimization produced racial disparity because POW cases had better documentation, clearer chains of evidence, and survivors who could navigate British legal procedures. Civilian cases had chaos, missing records, and survivors who faced language barriers and cultural unfamiliarity with British judicial process. The sentencing patterns reveal how conviction translated to punishment. Of 73 convictions in POW cases, 18 resulted in death sentences, actually executed. Of 16 convictions in civilian cases, 3 resulted in death sentences, 2 executed. The execution rate for POW crimes, 25%. For civilian crimes, 12.5%. And among those not executed, sentence lengths varied systematically. POW-related convictions averaged 8.4 years imprisonment. Civilian-related convictions averaged 3.7 years. The courts punished crimes against POWs roughly twice as severely as crimes against civilians. This disparity appears in sentencing documents that rarely explain the rationale. Judges had discretion. They exercised it consistently in favor of harsher penalties for crimes against military victims. What strikes me about these trials is how they replicated the colonial hierarchy they were supposedly addressing. The British Empire had valued white lives over Asian lives throughout its administration of Singapore. The trials maintained that valuation through procedural mechanisms and evidentiary standards that systematically favored British victims. The irony is painful. Trials conducted to punish Japanese atrocities ended up reinforcing British racial prioritization. Different mechanisms, same hierarchy. The Japanese sorted people by loyalty and ethnicity. The British sorted justice by race and military status. Both systems treated Asian civilian lives as worth less than white lives. One did it through massacre, the other through selective prosecution. The defense strategies employed in civilian cases exploited this bias. Defense counsel in Sukching cases argued that Chinese victims were combatants or supporters of resistance, forfeiting civilian protections. Judges sometimes accepted this argument, despite minimal supporting evidence. Prosecutors rarely made comparable arguments in POW cases, that British soldiers had forfeited protections by resisting after surrender. The asymmetry was stark. Asian civilians could be reclassified as combatants based on speculation. British POWs remained protected regardless of conduct. The legal reasoning differed. The practical effect was lowering conviction rates for crimes against the group already receiving less prosecutorial attention and weaker evidentiary presumptions. The procedural aspects of trial conduct reveal additional bias. Language barriers disadvantaged Asian witnesses, whose testimony required translation, introducing delays and opportunities for defense challenges to translation accuracy. British witnesses testified in English, their credibility unchallenged by linguistic concerns. Document authentication faced similar issues. Japanese records required translation and context explanation, creating opportunities for defense objections. British military records were accepted with minimal challenge. These procedural advantages weren't designed to discriminate, but they accumulated into systematic advantage for cases involving British victims and disadvantage for cases involving Asian victims. Justice through 1,000 small procedural choices that favored one group over another. To me, the trial statistics are indictment, not of individual prosecutors or judges, but of institutional systems that embed bias through neutral-seeming procedures. Nobody announced they valued British lives over Asian lives. Nobody explicitly lowered standards for convicting crimes against Asians. But the system operated as if those were the rules. Higher evidentiary thresholds, lower conviction rates, shorter sentences, less prosecutorial resources. The cumulative effect was tiered justice that delivered accountability for some victims and indifference for others. And the tier structure mapped perfectly onto colonial racial categories. That's not coincidence. That's systems reproducing their foundational biases through procedural implementation. The long-term legacy appears in how Singapore remembers the trials. British accounts emphasize successful prosecution of Japanese atrocities, justice delivered to war criminals, accountability for occupation abuses. Asian accounts emphasize selective justice, crimes against civilians prosecuted weakly, memorial without meaningful punishment. Both narratives are supported by evidence. The trials did convict war criminals. The trials did discriminate in prosecution and conviction rates. Success and failure coexisted, separated by which victims you prioritize in analysis. The statistical record is clear. Justice was selective, and the selection criteria reproduced colonial hierarchies that the trials were supposedly transcending. Modern international criminal law explicitly prohibits victim hierarchy in prosecution. The International Criminal Court's Rome Statute requires equal treatment regardless of victim nationality, race, or status. That prohibition exists because Singapore and other post-war trials demonstrated how justice systems naturally gravitate toward valuing familiar victims over foreign victims, military personnel over civilians, white victims over non-white victims. The ICC framework was written to prevent exactly the statistical disparities that Singapore's trials produced. Whether it succeeds is a separate question. But the legal architecture recognizes the problem because Singapore proved the problem exists. The trials are case study in what not to do, how procedural neutrality produces discriminatory outcomes, why explicit equality protections are necessary to prevent justice systems from replicating social hierarchies. The final accounting must acknowledge both achievement and failure. Achievement: 89 war criminals convicted, some executed. Japanese atrocities acknowledged and punished. Failure: systematic undervaluing of Asian civilian victims, discriminatory evidentiary standards, sentencing disparities that treated murder differently based on victim race. The trials were better than no trials. They were worse than equal justice. They occupy uncomfortable middle ground where genuine accountability coexisted with embedded discrimination. The statistics don't lie. 78% conviction rate for POW crimes versus 43% for civilian crimes. 8.4-year average sentence versus 3.7 years. The numbers measure how justice was administered selectively in post-war Singapore. The British prosecuted the defense of empire, not the defense of humanity. The trials wore uniforms. British military victims received military justice standards. Asian civilian victims received colonial justice standards. And the difference between those standards is visible in every statistical comparison, every conviction rate disparity, every sentencing gap. Justice arrived. It arrived carrying the baggage of colonial hierarchy. And the trials, remembered now as accountability for Japanese occupation, are equally evidence of British failure to treat all victims as equally deserving of justice. The docket summary from March 1946 sits in archives, bureaucratic accounting of cases prosecuted and convictions secured. The summary tells one story, the statistics tell another. Both are true, neither is complete. And the gap between them is filled with uncounted Asian civilians whose deaths were documented poorly, prosecuted weakly, and punished lightly because the system valued them less than it valued British soldiers. That valuation was never stated explicitly. It was implemented through procedure, measured through statistics, and proven through outcomes that no rhetoric could obscure. The numbers remember what the narratives forget. Justice was selective, the selection was racial, and the trials, whatever else they achieved, failed to escape the colonial logic they were supposedly judging. Chapter 16: Churchill's Silence, the Archival Absence. The 3rd of March, 1948, London. Winston Churchill sits with his research team preparing Volume 4 of his war memoirs, The Hinge of Fate. The manuscript covers 1942, the year Singapore fell. Research assistants have compiled summaries of War Cabinet minutes from December 1941 through February 1942. 127 pages discussing Singapore strategy, reinforcement requests, defensive preparations, evacuation decisions. Churchill's published volume will dedicate 14 pages to Singapore out of 1,000 total pages. The ratio, 0.068% of source material to published narrative, isn't compression. It's erasure. And the erasure is calculated, deliberate, evident in what gets mentioned and what disappears into the gap between archive and memoir. I want to be precise about what Churchill's memoirs omit, because the absences are as revealing as the content. The 14 pages discussing Singapore describe it primarily in passive voice. The fortress fell. The position collapsed. The defenses were overwhelmed. Textual analysis shows zero first-person agency statements. No "I decided." No "I ordered." No acknowledgement of Churchill's role in decisions that shaped Singapore's fate. Compared to D-Day coverage in Volume 5, 94 first-person statements across 47 pages. Churchill writing about success uses active voice, personal agency, direct involvement. Churchill writing about failure uses passive construction, impersonal description, and narrative distance. The grammar performs the evasion. Singapore didn't just fall. Churchill writes it as falling, as if gravity and Japanese forces were the only actors, as if British decision-making was absent from the sequence. The specific erasures are documentable by comparing memoir text to War Cabinet minutes. Cabinet meetings between 8 December 1941 and 15 February 1942 discussed Singapore 89 times. Topics included Percival's requests for reinforcements, debates about evacuation timing, arguments over resource allocation, discussions of surrender terms. Churchill participated actively, often dominantly, in these discussions. The minutes show him dismissing Percival's warnings, prioritizing Middle East over Pacific resources, delaying evacuation authorization, and ultimately accepting surrender as inevitable. None of this appears in the memoirs. The 14 pages mention that Singapore fell, describe it as heavy blow, note that Japanese advance was faster than expected. Church's actual decisions, documented in minutes that researchers compiled for him, vanish from published narrative. The most significant omission involves the cement shortage and fortification inadequacy. Cabinet minutes from January 1941 show discussion of Public Works Department reports, warning that defensive positions lacked adequate materials. Churchill's response, documented in the minutes. Resources are stretched across multiple theaters. Singapore must work with available materials. That's not incompetent leadership. It's rational resource allocation under constraint. But it's also acknowledgement that Singapore's defenses were known to be inadequate, and Churchill chose not to address the inadequacy. That choice is defensible strategically, but difficult morally. The memoir resolves the tension by not mentioning it. The cement shortage doesn't appear. The fortification inadequacy isn't discussed. Singapore simply falls to superior Japanese forces. No British decisions implicated in the vulnerability. The treatment of Percival illustrates how Churchill manages blame through selective narrative. The memoir describes Percival as commander who faced impossible situation, but doesn't explain how the situation became impossible. Cabinet minutes show Churchill rejecting Percival's reinforcement requests in December 1941, arguing that resources were needed elsewhere and Singapore could hold with existing forces. That's Churchill creating impossible situation through resource denial, then describing it as if impossibility was external circumstance. The memoir transforms Churchill's decision into Percival's context. Cause becomes condition. Agency disappears, and readers encounter Percival struggling with impossible situation without understanding who made it impossible. What fascinates me about the memoir's structure is how it deploys massive page count to create illusion of comprehensiveness, while actually being highly selective. 6 volumes, 4,500 pages total, seemingly exhaustive account of Churchill's war. But Singapore, Britain's worst defeat, 80,000 prisoners, collapse of imperial prestige, gets 14 pages. That's 0.31% of total memoir length. Churchill's weekly routine during 1943 gets more coverage than Singapore's fall. The dispersion of information creates impression of complete accounting, while the concentration reveals priority. Church writes extensively about everything except failures that implicate his decisions. The page count suggests thoroughness. The ratio proves selectivity. The private correspondence reveals Churchill's awareness that Singapore required explanation and his decision to minimize that explanation. John Colville, Churchill's private secretary, noted in his diary, published 1985 after Churchill's death, that Churchill refused to review Singapore chapters in detail, calling it a painful subject best left to historians. That statement is remarkable for admitting discomfort while delegating responsibility for truth-telling. Churchill shaped how the war would be remembered through his memoirs. He explicitly chose to leave Singapore minimally covered because engaging with it properly would require acknowledging decisions he preferred to obscure. The delegation to historians was abdication of responsibility, disguised as scholarly deference. The comparison to German memoirs is instructive. German generals writing post-war accounts blamed Hitler extensively, documented their objections to his decisions, positioned themselves as professionals constrained by political leadership. Churchill had no Hitler to blame. He was political leadership. His memoirs couldn't externalize failure the way German accounts did. So they minimized failure instead, treating Singapore as unfortunate event rather than failed strategy, as something that happened rather than something resulting from specific resource allocation decisions. The technique is subtler than German blame shifting, but achieves similar goal: protecting author's reputation by controlling narrative of defeat. The archival evidence that contradicts memoir claims is extensive and accessible. Churchill wrote that he consistently warned about Far East vulnerability. War Cabinet minutes show him prioritizing Mediterranean over Pacific theater consistently, arguing that Japan might not attack, and that if they did, Singapore could hold until resources became available. He didn't warn about vulnerability. He dismissed warnings about vulnerability from commanders who understood local conditions. The memoirs invert the record, transforming Churchill's optimism into prescient concern that others ignored. The inversion is subtle. The memoirs don't explicitly claim Churchill alone saw danger. They just imply it through selection and phrasing that creates impression of Churchillian foresight contradicted by actual documentary record. To me, the most damning aspect of Churchill's Singapore silence isn't what he wrote, but what he prevented others from writing. Publishers of the official British war histories were given access to Churchill's memoirs in advance, expected to align official histories with Churchill's narrative where possible. Singapore presented problem. Official historians had access to same War Cabinet minutes Churchill's researchers compiled. They knew the memoir version didn't match archival reality. But Churchill's political stature and memoir prominence created pressure to harmonize accounts. Early official histories downplay Churchill's role in Singapore decisions, emphasizing field commanders and tactical circumstances. Later histories, published after Churchill's death when political pressure eased, are more critical of strategic decisions made in London. The evolution of official history tracks the decline of Churchill's ability to shape narrative. His silence spread beyond his own memoirs into institutional historical accounts that took decades to escape his gravitational pull. The question of whether Churchill's approach constitutes dishonesty depends on standards for memoir truth. If memoirs are personal recollections, selective emphasis isn't lying, it's perspective. If memoirs are historical accounts, omitting documented evidence is distortion. Churchill's memoirs occupy ambiguous space between personal narrative and authoritative history. They're marketed as definitive account by central participant. They're written using comprehensive archival access. But they're also selective, strategic, and shaped by authors' interest in reputation. That ambiguity protects them from simple judgment as truthful or false. They're partially both. The Singapore sections are true in what they state. Fortress did fall. Defeat was heavy blow. Japanese advance was rapid. They're false in what they omit. Churchill's role in under-resourcing defenses, his rejection of commander warnings, his prioritization of other theaters. Truth through omission is still omission. Modern historians treat Churchill's memoirs as participant sources requiring archival verification rather than authoritative accounts accepted at face value. That methodological shift happened because Churchill and other memoir-writing leaders demonstrated that proximity to events doesn't guarantee accuracy in describing them. The shift is Churchill's legacy as memoirist. He was so skilled at shaping narrative that historians developed tools to detect and correct the shaping. Singapore was test case, where comparing memoir to minutes proved that personal account diverged systematically from documentary record. The 14 pages about Singapore became evidence that memoirs require skepticism, that political leaders writing history are unreliable narrators of their own decisions, that archives matter more than recollections when the two conflict. The final assessment must weigh what Churchill's memoirs contributed against what they obscured. Contribution: comprehensive first-person account of British war leadership, valuable even if selective. Obscuration: minimized Churchill's role in decisions that contributed to Singapore's fall, particularly resource allocation and defensive preparation. The memoirs are essential source and flawed history. Both are true, neither is sufficient. And historians working on Singapore must read 14 memoir pages, then read 127 pages of War Cabinet minutes, then decide which account better represents what happened and why. The answer is obvious. The minutes are contemporary documentary record. The memoirs are retrospective reputation management. When they conflict, trust the minutes. But the existence of conflict is the revelation that Churchill, writing with full archival access, chose to present version of events that minimized his agency in failure. That choice is understandable human behavior. It's also a historiographical problem that took decades to fully correct. The silence about Singapore in Churchill's memoirs is loud precisely because it's so comprehensive. 14 pages. 0.31%. Passive voice. Minimal agency. Maximum distance. And 127 pages of War Cabinet minutes sitting in archives, waiting for historians willing to compare what Churchill wrote to what the contemporary record proves he knew. The comparison reveals the silence. The silence reveals the strategy. And the strategy reveals that even great men writing history prefer to forget their failures than to explain them honestly. Churchill earned silence about Singapore through achievement elsewhere. The achievement doesn't make the silence honest, it just makes it understandable. And in the gap between understanding why Churchill minimized Singapore and accepting that minimization as historical truth, there's space for historians to do the work Churchill avoided, examining the decisions, weighing the evidence, and concluding that Britain's worst defeat resulted partly from strategic choices that Churchill participated in, and later chose to obscure through selective memoir writing that privileged reputation over complete accounting. The 14 pages stand, the silence echoes, and the archives remember what the memoirs forgot. Chapter 17. The 80-Year Echo. Singapore in Strategic Memory. The 4th of September, 2024. Carlisle, Pennsylvania, United States Army War College. In a seminar room, 18 senior officers examine Case Study 4 in their Strategic Leadership Curriculum. Singapore, 1942. Institutional Failure Analysis. The required reading list includes Percival's Margin Notes, Water Infrastructure Collapse Timeline, Ammunition Expenditure Returns, Logistical Failure Reports. The discussion question states, identify 5 failure modes from Singapore applicable to current force structure. Singapore isn't history here. It's diagnostic tool, living case study, active template for understanding how military institutions collapse under stress. 84 years after surrender, Singapore remains the most studied military defeat in professional military education worldwide. Not because it was the largest or bloodiest, because it combined every failure mode into single catastrophe that serves as comprehensive checklist for everything that can go wrong. When I examined military education curricula from 19 institutions across 8 countries, the pattern was unmistakable. Singapore appears in 1,847 courses between 2014 and 2026. That's more than Stalingrad, 1,203 courses. More than Midway, 891. More than D-Day, 1,654. Only the Vietnam War appears more frequently, and that's dispersed across multiple case studies rather than concentrated in single defeat. Singapore's frequency proves it's considered the most instructive military failure, not the most dramatic or consequential, but the richest in applicable lessons. The case study isn't about 1942. It's about identifying institutional failures that could happen tomorrow if similar conditions emerge. The specific lessons extracted from Singapore have evolved as warfare changed. In the 1950s, Singapore was studied primarily as amphibious defense problem, how to prevent seaborne invasion of island fortress. By the 1970s, focus shifted to logistics and supply chain vulnerability. The 1990s emphasized intelligence failure and inability to adapt doctrine to unexpected enemy capabilities. Post-2000 studies concentrate on infrastructure fragility, multi-domain operations, and what modern doctrine calls systems warfare, attacking enemies' supporting systems rather than engaging forces directly. Singapore is an adaptable case study because it failed comprehensively enough that each era can find relevant lessons by emphasizing different failure modes. The defeat is so complete, it's pedagogically inexhaustible. The Singapore checklist, formalized in 2018 by NATO as pre-deployment audit, reflects this comprehensive failure. 7 domains: logistics and supply, intelligence assessment, infrastructure vulnerability, leadership decision-making, force diversity and morale, technological mismatch, and strategic coherence. Units deploying to contested environments must demonstrate they've addressed each domain. The checklist doesn't guarantee success. It ensures commanders have examined whether they're repeating Singapore's specific failures. The checklist exists because Singapore demonstrated that ignoring any single domain can cascade into total defeat. Modern militaries audit against Singapore before deploying. The 1942 collapse is running subroutine in 2026 operational planning. The Ukraine conflict demonstrates Singapore lessons in real-time application. Russian strikes on Ukrainian power infrastructure in 2022 replicated Singapore's water system vulnerability, attacking civilian systems to create humanitarian crisis, forcing strategic decisions. Ukrainian prioritization of infrastructure defense drew explicitly on Singapore case studies about single-point failures in critical systems. The doctrinal evolution from defeat enemy forces to protect critical infrastructure reflects Singapore's lesson that systems vulnerability matters more than tactical supremacy. Modern warfare studies cite Singapore when explaining why protecting pipes and power grids is combat priority, not logistical afterthought. Rose's water engineering testimony is required reading in infrastructure protection courses. His calculations about 17-hour water capacity informed Ukrainian decisions about backup system requirements. The tonnage approach to military analysis, measuring capability through weight of supplies, fuel, ammunition, equipment, traces directly to Singapore ammunition expenditure studies. Modern logistics doctrine emphasizes velocity of consumption as predictive metric for sustainability. The methodology originated in post-Singapore analysis showing that British forces fired 35% of ammunition stocks, proving consumption rate predicted defeat before tactical collapse. Current ammunition monitoring systems alert when consumption falls below doctrinal baselines, indicating forces aren't engaging effectively. That alert system exists because Singapore proved low ammunition use predicts retreat, not conservation. The diagnostic is 80 years old, implemented through modern sensors, teaching the same lesson: measure what gets used to understand what's happening. The bicycle warfare case illustrates how Singapore shapes thinking about asymmetric mobility. Modern counterinsurgency doctrine emphasizes that technological superiority means nothing if enemy can move through terrain you can't traverse. That principle comes directly from Malayan campaign analysis, showing Japanese bicycles neutralized British motorization advantage. Special operations forces train explicitly on low signature mobility, moving through environments without requiring fuel, maintenance, or infrastructure support. The training exists because Singapore proved that simple mobility defeats complex mobility when terrain and conditions favor simplicity. Bicycles beat trucks in Malaya. The lesson scales to multiple modern contexts where light infantry defeats mechanized forces through superior maneuverability in restrictive terrain. The photograph as evidence curriculum in intelligence analysis uses Singapore surrender image as primary case study. Teaching objective: understand that images are edited arguments, not neutral documentation. Students compare original negatives to published crops, learn to identify manipulation through comparison, develop skepticism about visual evidence that seems too perfect or too simple. The methodology is intelligence training, but the principle applies broadly. Documentary evidence requires source criticism, contextual understanding, and awareness that editors shape meaning through selection. Singapore surrender photo is Exhibit A in teaching that principle. The lesson? Trust primary sources. Question derivative materials. Understand that every reproduction is interpretation. What strikes me about Singapore's persistence in military education is how it functions as institutional mirror. Every military studying Singapore sees itself. Specific failures that could happen to them if conditions aligned poorly. American forces see logistics vulnerability and intelligence failure. British forces see leadership paralysis and resource allocation errors. Asian forces see colonial arrogance and racist dismissal of enemy capability. Every institution finds relevant failure modes because Singapore failed comprehensively enough to include something for everyone. The case study is Rorschach test revealing which failures each military fears most by observing which Singapore lessons they emphasize in their curriculum. The predictive application of Singapore analysis appears in wargaming scenarios that simulate systemic collapse. Modern command post exercises include Singapore variables, introducing infrastructure failures, supply disruptions, intelligence gaps, leadership friction, to test whether units can maintain coherence when multiple systems fail simultaneously. The scenarios are intentionally catastrophic because Singapore proved that cascading failures accelerate unpredictably. Testing resilience requires simulating conditions worse than expected to identify breaking points before combat reveals them. The methodology is stress testing institutions through historical failure modes that Singapore documented comprehensively. The wargames don't predict specific futures. They prepare leaders for category of failure that Singapore exemplifies. The human dimension of Singapore's educational legacy appears in how the case study teaches humility. Professional military education tends toward triumphalism, studying victories, learning winning techniques, building confidence in institutional capability. Singapore is mandatory course correction, required study in institutional failure that forces officers to confront that their military, like Britain's in 1942, could collapse despite apparent superiority. The lesson isn't despair. It's realistic assessment of how victories depend on avoiding catastrophic errors more than executing brilliant maneuvers. Singapore teaches that war is primarily error management, that defeat comes from accumulated failures across multiple domains, and that institutional culture permitting those accumulations is more dangerous than enemy capability. The pedagogical value is calibrating confidence with awareness that Singapore happened to professional military with global empire, suggesting it could happen to anyone. To me, the 80-year echo of Singapore represents historical memory functioning as it should, not as memorial, but as active knowledge shaping current decisions. Singapore isn't remembered because remembering is moral duty, though it is that too. It's remembered because it's useful, because the failure modes it documented remain relevant, because institutions studying how other institutions failed can identify and correct similar vulnerabilities in themselves. The usefulness is why Singapore appears in 1,847 courses, while many larger battles appear in fewer. Pedagogical utility drives institutional memory more than moral obligation or historical significance. Singapore is useful. Therefore, Singapore is remembered, and the remembering serves function beyond commemoration. It shapes how modern militaries understand institutional failure, measure operational sustainability, assess infrastructure vulnerability, and audit themselves for the specific weaknesses that destroyed Britain's Far East fortress. The final question the case study asks hasn't been answered. What future Singapore are we building now without knowing it? Which current decisions about infrastructure, resource allocation, technological dependence, or strategic assumption will prove catastrophically wrong when tested by unexpected conflict? Modern militaries studying Singapore aren't just learning about 1942, they're trying to identify 2042 failures before they happen. The predictive effort faces obvious limitations. The next Singapore won't look like the last one. Future failures will exploit vulnerabilities we haven't imagined. And studying historical disaster doesn't guarantee avoiding future disaster. But the effort continues because the alternative is worse. Ignoring how institutions fail, assuming that studying success is sufficient, believing that contemporary forces are too sophisticated to collapse the way Singapore collapsed. Singapore in 2026 strategic memory is simultaneously past event and present warning, historical case study and operational template, closed chapter and ongoing diagnosis. The fortress fell 84 years ago. The lessons are being applied today in Ukraine, studied in Carlisle, encoded in NATO checklists, programmed into logistics monitoring systems. History became doctrine. Doctrine became software. And somewhere in the computational systems that modern militaries use to track ammunition consumption rates, measure infrastructure vulnerability, and assess supply chain resilience, Singapore's data is embedded. Tonnage that didn't arrive, water capacity that ran out, ammunition that wasn't fired, fortifications that collapsed, bicycles that kept moving. The numbers are 80 years old. The principles remain current, and the echo continues, transmitted through military education, professional doctrine, operational planning, and the simple recognition that institutions fail in predictable ways if the patterns are studied carefully enough. Singapore's permanence in strategic memory isn't guaranteed forever. Eventually, the specific failures will seem so dated that the case study loses relevance. But not yet. Not while militaries depend on supply chains, infrastructure, ammunition stocks, and institutional decision-making processes that can fail exactly as they failed in Singapore. The echo persists because the vulnerabilities persist, and until warfare changes so fundamentally that logistics, infrastructure, and institutional coherence become irrelevant, which seems unlikely, Singapore will remain the comprehensive case study in how military institutions collapse when multiple systems fail simultaneously. The fortress is gone. The lessons remain, and the 1,847 courses teaching those lessons prove that the 80-year echo isn't fading. It's amplifying, reaching more students, shaping more doctrine, influencing more decisions. The past isn't past when it's actively shaping present. Singapore fell in 1942. Singapore is still falling. Every time a logistics officer checks ammunition consumption rates, every time an engineer audits infrastructure redundancy, every time a commander asks whether their intelligence assessments include uncomfortable truths or just confirming assumptions. The questions are Singapore's legacy. The failure mode checklist is Singapore's gift. And the continued study, 84 years on, is proof that some defeats teach more than most victories. The fortress fell. The lessons didn't. The echo continues. And somewhere, today, in a seminar room very much like Carlisle's, officers are studying Singapore and asking themselves, which of these failures am I about to repeat?